And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room tonight already. Of course, tonight, as usual, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And,
Uh-oh.
oh, that's interesting. There's an echo in here. Hold on. Hold on. There we go. Yeah, it was just, it's funny that came up because I was just about to tell you that a crime took place right here in Harvard Square.
Okay.
And this woman, apparently, there's a big skeleton sort of statue outside of a tiki place.
Oh, you mean like Halloween?
I don't know if it was for
Decoration,
Halloween.
probably?
I've actually only seen this thing once, but
Mhm.
she was caught on camera stealing the arm off this thing, and now there's a big hunt going on for the arm. There it is, featured. Unbelievable. The things that happen, Saturday nights. I'm telling
It's
you.
true, and it's basically a full moon. We're getting there.
That's true. We had a fantastic show last night, and that was with Millie Weaver. And Millie did a great job. What was the show last night? Just did that live show. That interview went out yesterday, and there were a lot of very interesting things in there. Of course, Millie has had a very interesting career. She's been a documentary filmmaker. Her 2 documentaries on us, very interesting, Shadowgate, all that behind the scenes surveillance work and big tech censorship and all the political intrigues that she gets into. And of course, she even started off, remember back in the whole InfoWars, Alex Jones days. And she's gone a lot further than that, but she was doing good reports back then. And one of the good things I'd like to say about Millie is she's very good at that kind of, let's have the facts. And she's a really good on the spot style reporter. And so that interview is up there for you. But something very interesting is in there, which is I had known from some messages that she had information relating to the Mar-a-Lago raid, and we put that in the interview as much as we could. And her source was telling her that something in that Mar-a-Lago raid related directly to the Space Force, which I found very interesting because, of course, when the raid came up, my first reaction was, this is related to the UFO file, no question about it. Some people talked about nukes, other people talked about the, all of the CIA documents. The JFK assassination files figure also into that Mar-a-Lago raid, and that's something that I went over with Dr. Joseph Farrell back last month when all this was happening. But this is a big piece for what we look at with the State of the Union. There's going to be some predictions included with this. And I'm also going to say that the X-steganography now is really getting into a fever pitch out there in the public. Now, when we introduced it 4 years ago here on this program in 2018, just getting all that research that I had in relation to the X-steganography that was going through these different government agencies, it was kind of interesting because at the time we were looking at a number of situations that didn't make sense. And the clash with the media, the instant censorship, the really bullying of the social media companies. And that was just pre-COVID. And so it's been an interesting journey for us here over the past 4 years as we've gone from sharing this with the Ideas Room in these circles of the things that we do, and then it blowing, prime time through the likes of Musk and other figures now. And of course, Bezos doing his own Blue Origin space thing with a big X logo. So we're looking at the X-steganography going online. And we need to talk about what those implications are about and why that X-steganography is so important as it dates back through these mystery schools and secret societies right up through our advanced technological signaling. And one of the things I like to go over when it comes to steganography is it's a little different from cryptography and different types of systems in that everything is right out there in plain sight. That's the nature of steganography. And also it's been used quite a lot now. We've seen it used in relation to how they would term computer software steganography and how groups send messages one to another with one pixel inside of a software. That's sort of like the 21st century of this. But let me tell you, steganography has been going on for a long time, and you're going to find it in the Book of the Dead with the Egyptians. So there's a reason why we put that focus on it. And I've gone on the record saying that if you get the key to X steganography, that's like opening up the Rosetta Stone, which gave us the key to the hieroglyphics of Egypt, and understood the entire culture through that by getting the language right. And otherwise, we just had a bunch of fancy buildings with interesting markings on them that we couldn't decipher. But the Rosetta Stone is that kind of classic reference because it had the same announcement, which was, praising the king at the time. And it was in 3 different languages. And one of those languages, thank God, was the hieroglyphics. So we were able to read directly from that. There's still some mysteries in relation to Egyptian hieroglyphics and how they put things. And I would also say that Augustus Le Plongeon back in...
You love saying that.
Well, he is one of my faves. Back in 1888, solved the Mayan hieroglyphs, but they didn't want that at the time. The American Archaeological Society said, no. Those savage Indians didn't have their own language. Get out. And Le Plongeon is really fascinating too, because he opened up so much. He understood that the Egyptians came over to America, and he was also a psychic archaeologist. So there's all kinds of problems and all kinds of intrigues with him. But unfortunately, his deciphering of the hieroglyphs was rejected outright. But I want us to look at that X steganography as a door opener. It's kind of gives us more perception and a new language for us to read. And it doesn't have to be, very often we can look for things and read meaning into them. But the X steganography is out there in the open anyway. So that's the very nature of steganography. Is it's not something that you have to deeply go find. It's something that you need to read that's right under your nose. And that's the way we're going to approach it tonight. This is the X State of the Union right here. And we're going to go deep tonight. It is the UFO file key. And you bet that the UFO file is where that X technology resides. We're going to go into how that plays into what's happening now, and also how it got started. How exactly did they formulate this system of secrecy, and why are we living in a kind of schizophrenic situation in relation to that? Now, we're going to go maybe about 90 minutes with this tonight. In the last half hour of the program, we'll take your questions, which Miss Olivia is going to put together. And I want to say, Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Fantastic.
It's actually a little quiet tonight.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's good.
This being Saturday night, not our usual night.
Well, it looks like a huge ideas room to me. So I guess the questions will be rolling in later. Ask the questions all in caps, and Miss Olivia, you can actually ask her now, and she'll take them for later.
Mm-hmm.
She's good like that. She puts it together. And one of the things I want to point out also is that if you're new to the program, you want to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's going to keep you sort of informed of all the great shows, events, documentaries, interviews, things you don't want to miss. And it's free, highly informative, and everything you need right there, getting it in your inbox on Fridays. And that's it. No marketing, no nothing. Just boom, it's there for you. And you're going to need it. So make sure that you do that at darkjournalist.com. And also some of the kind of great X series episodes that we have coming up for you, going through the end of the fall here into the winter, and the remarkable, and I mean remarkable, interviews and shows that we have coming up. You don't want to miss it, so make sure you're on there. Okay, and with that, I am going to start into some of the kind of wild moves that are going on right now, and this is coming straight out of the Biden situation. I'm going to relate the Biden situation, Stepford Biden, the president currently, alive and well only in theory, and we're going to relate that directly to the Ukraine situation, and the Ukraine situation to the UFO file and the UFO threat narrative that the CIA has been pushing to create these false UFO offices. Incidentally, I heard that the Arrow, the new Project Blue Book 2022 Redux, that they've put together with Avril Haines, the DNI in charge of it, is in trouble. And that now the National Defense Authorization Act, the new one for 2023, is going to bounce AARO and is going to start a new phony UFO threat office. So we don't know the name of that one yet, but I've got that from an inside track. That's going to happen. So we're already into 2023 shaping up. There you go, new UFO office to make everyone jump up and down. And I'm going to get into some very interesting anniversaries that are coming up, including the 5-year anniversary of the false UFO threat program, which was created by the likes of Jim Semivan, CIA head honcho, and Lou Elizondo, the counterintelligence agent, who failed to generate the kind of interest that was necessary and is now probably begrudgingly handing the baton over to Gary Nolan, a CIA insider scientist who is in tight with Fauci. And I'm going to get into Nolan's ties to Fauci or some of the things on that general line with Nolan. There's a lot of people who write me about Nolan and they're like, he could never be involved with the CIA. Look, it's not something that is coming from me. This is his bio. If you just do half-inch research on Gary Nolan, you're going to find CIA, up to your neck. So he's very deep into it and he doesn't hide it. So, we have a little bit of that hero thing that goes on once in a while when they put someone forward and they're like, well, I'm in the establishment, but I'm also a contactee. Yes, I am the CIA agent, but, here's your come to Jesus moment on the alien thing with CIA contactees, which is something I never really thought they'd get this low. This is pretty low. They have 3 very prominent ones right now, and this is the thing that we need to watch out for. Semivan himself claims to be an abductee, along with John Ramirez, who shopped himself out to all these UFO shows saying, yes, I'm ex-CIA, but I'm also Whitley Strieber reincarnated. No, you're not. And Gary Nolan is another one, but in his case, there's a lot of problems with the Nolan thing because he's an immunologist and he's a Stanford professor and he's deeply involved with Stanford X, which is this lab dealing with genetic modification and things that someone who's leaning in on the CIA side, and I've pointed this out before, that a lot of these guys who have been coming forward on the CIA UFO threat side are very involved with immunology, development of diseases, genetic modification, what's going on here with this. And I think the sooner we get to the bottom of that, the better. This is part of the problem of the disconnect of the UFO group, the UFO community from the deep state researchers, because the deep state researchers would follow that through and this would be well connected and everyone would know. And I've put forward these things over the past few years. I think we're starting to get the idea. But there's a great reluctance on the deep state researcher side. So a lot of those people who understand things like the JFK assassination or, political coups and things of this nature, they don't like to touch the UFO file because the UFO researchers generally show up as not very serious. And now, especially when they're palling around with the CIA, it looks, it's not a good look. And counterintelligence agents all over the place. So I think that we need to plug those 2 areas in, and I'm going to plug those 2 areas in together tonight. And I'm going to do that through the figure of an admiral named Bobby Inman, who comes up in a documentary that I did 2 years ago, but his ability to navigate between that JFK situation and the UFO file is the thing that we need in order to hook up those 2 kind of deep state research areas and then the UFO file research areas. If those come together, then so many of these mysteries are going to be lifted. Otherwise, we're going to be in this weird labyrinth for a good long time. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the X State of the Union, and we're going deep tonight. It is the UFO file key. And as I said, we're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the program. Before I dive in, Miss Olivia, go for it.
Greg O'Brien is asking, I thought the CIA couldn't operate on U.S. soil.
That was, that's been true and is generally true, except when they reorganized the intelligence agencies after 9/11, they got more leeway to do that. Of course, they'd been operating in domestic civilian life all the way through since they were founded in 1947. And there's also a piece of their charter which has never been seen by anyone in the public. And the other piece of their charter, and this is something that I learned from Professor Peter Dale Scott, which is that they are not subject to prosecution for anything that they do. And that's a really big loophole. So they might be able to take an occasional agent and, put him up on trial for charges, but you cannot take the organization and charge it. So that's a huge disconnect. It's entirely unconstitutional, and it makes the Central Intelligence Agency an extra constitutional agency in the United States. So that would need to be repealed by a sensible authority and leadership. If we had a drastic change in leadership, we'd have a very different society. And we have to also remember, so much of this is not to make the CIA a boogeyman, it's to understand their role and how the whole idea and foundation of the deep state can't function without the Central Intelligence Agency. And the Central Intelligence Agency being that brainchild of lawyers for international finance in New York out of S&C like Alan Dulles thinking, we can connect up all our international finance and represent our guys using the entire apparatus of the United States, its defense power, its ability to manipulate other countries, and so on. And, there's a lot of foundational things in relation to the CIA, of course, the OSS and good old wild Bill Donovan, and the OPC version, which was the really Office of Policy Coordination, which was just doing wild things. The original CIA were basically pencil pushers. They were people who were absorbed different types of foreign policy. And as President Truman at the time laid out, that they were only supposed to gather intelligence for the president to review, not overthrow other countries and create the Bay of Pigs and things of this nature, or all the things that they're up to now. And a lot of people have said, well, that was a past era of the CIA and they've reformed. Well, there's never been any effort to reform them except in the 70s. And, as far as I know, they just were planning the assassination of Julian Assange right before we grabbed him. So, it sounds to me like their assassination program is doing just fine. I haven't heard anybody say that they've quit that. So it's very interesting to me. The CIA got a really bad wave of attention in the 70s, and we got to see their books. And that was just the public side, though. The things that they really had going on in the background, MK Ultra and all the rest of it, they burned those records and they ran out the back door with that. The kind of corridor between the defense contractors, the CIA, and the aerospace companies, that is that piece I referred to on this program as X Protect. It plays in exactly with all the things we're hearing about X. And that unit has been set up in an entirely illegal fashion to completely destroy public awareness around the UFO issue, to hide those records and to spin us off these ridiculous narratives about UFO threats and create these offices now. And one of the things I've been pointing out is that we have these Congress people who are suddenly these incredible UFO enthusiasts. And, it's like, I never heard of you in relation to the UFO thing at all, ever. Mike Gallagher, you're one of them. Congressman from Wisconsin. Kirsten Gillibrand, from New York. Are you on record with any kind of interest in UFOs ever before this? Marco Rubio suddenly is the biggest champion of UFOs. Oh, they're a big threat. I want to bomb Iran and bomb the aliens, basically. So we have to be very aware of the structure that is rising up in the background and where it's coming from. Where is all this coming from? Who are these people? Tim Burchett out in Tennessee. Suddenly they're leading the charge on UFOs. Where are they getting? And so what I've done, and that's like a yoga stretch. I've put together, this has been my general thing with so many of these. So Burchett and these other Congress people will come together and they will say, I'm challenging the government to get us those UAP videos. Just say UFO and get it over with. And what I'm doing on each of them is I'm basically copy and pasting my response respectfully and saying, what got you interested in UFOs, Congressman? So give us that story. At least give us the narrative. Tell us, like, are they early experiences as a child? How did this happen to you? This is a very important part of the conversation. Why are these people interested? Now, they may all have been hearing something about a gigantic boondoggle in relation to technology, to money, to budgets, to new offices, defense contracts, and they want a piece of it. That makes more sense to me, because otherwise they're going to have to give us a good answer about how they got into this in the first place. I think that's only fair. All right, let's keep rolling on that. It's great. Mixed in with that was just a picture of Annie Besant and Henry Olcott doing.
It's
the
a good
expert
palate cleanser. Right?
It is indeed. This, of course, is Gary Nolan and Dr. Nolan. And he's been putting that out there, the whole bit. And he's been saying, well, basically I had these encounters and like, I know all about the UFO thing. And, I'm breaking down the doors, and Tucker Carlson's having on like, oh my God, your UFO revelations. Look, this is a CIA operation. Let's get real. Okay. They want a UFO threat first. They couldn't get that. They've had problems with it. They'll come back and recycle that one. But right now, what they're trying to do is create these sentient, AIs connecting us with the idea of aliens. That's one of the areas that they're doing it in. Now, one of the things I pointed out was that, Nolan's people, some of the people said, well, you said Nolan's, big with Fauci and all that, and we've never seen that or whatever. And I've said, look at his Twitter feed, but I keep getting these emails for it. All right, for the record now, and I'm not exposing anything that's not public, but this is Nolan. Thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your tremendously positive contributions to immunology and virology. And this is on the announcement that Fauci may be outgoing, and he posts Fauci's picture. I mean, is that clear enough for you? Okay, so he's an immunologist and he's a fan of Dr. Fauci. All right. Now, love him, love it or hate it. That's the name of the game. Gary Nolan, your UFO scientist guy that they're touting on all these programs, who also happens to be a contactee, is shouting out to Fauci on Twitter saying, you're the greatest, basically, right? You're the original gangsta. So, I hope that puts that to rest in relation to that. The question is, what are they up to? Well, one of the things when he was first coming out, he had this bit about a look inside people's brains who said they had a UFO encounter. And this was an interesting angle they were coming in on. And they were going to say, well, the people who've had these experiences, their brain chemistry has changed, and the CIA can help figure out what that is with their scientists. Professor has been testing the brains of people who say they've experienced a UFO encounter, and these are the symptoms they display. Dr. Gary Nolan, a professor of pathology at Stanford University, who's published more than 300 research articles and holds 40 U.S. patents. Here we go with the patents again. Remember, Elizondo holds all these disease patents? Has spent the past decade analyzing materials from alleged unidentified aerial phenomena, and goes on to this whole diatribe about it. Now, what I'm getting with the Nolan op that's different from the Elizondo op is all the fear aspects are gone. So, Lou sitting there and saying like they're doing 50 Gs, and they're doing these maneuvers, and we can't match that, so it's a threat, and we need to get everybody on board with that. That message is getting switched. As a matter of fact, Elizondo himself in a recent program came out and was talking about, oh, well, if this thing about UAPs, they've been here a long time and they haven't done anything to us yet, so I guess there's no problem. So he's changing because that whole thing failed. So the CIA outright threat op is now in the hands of the media. They need to gin it back up. And one of the things they did was said, the U.S. government came out and said the UFO threat has advanced exponentially. Exponentially. This is the thing that they pushed back in August. So the UFO threat thing is competing with the UFO AI science thing. And in the middle of that, we have the Ukraine war and the strange references in that war to UFO activity over Ukraine, with our friend Zelensky leading the cheers. And here's another $100 billion for you. So we have some very unusual things there. And then we're going to see how this relates to our friend close by at Harvard, Avi Loeb, and his astrophysics lab and the things that he's doing there, and a strange visit that he got early in the morning, according to him, from someone from the UAP task force. Well, the UAP task force, last time I checked, is in Washington, D.C. So I guess they flew up here for a special message mission to Cambridge. Let's look at some of these and then see how this relates to what they're rolling out into this whole nuclear pie. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Sorry, I'm actually really interested in the chat tonight and the
Good,
ideas
good,
around.
good.
So,
What have you got? Lay it on me.
I don't know where to start. Fred D says Gary Nolan made 3 different statements about his beliefs on UFO aliens in 3 different broadcasts. Is there any consistency?
That's a good point. Well, they try out different things, and a lot of what they're doing are trial balloons. Let's remember this too, that so they've had the threat, and now Avi Loeb is in charge of the AI part. So Oumuamua and these other, large things that come into the solar system, he's saying, oh, they're alien spaceships and they're trying to communicate with us, but their AI is too good and we need to get ours connected up with theirs. And so that op is all about saying, Oumuamua communicated with us and it told us that we're destroying the environment and people need to pay carbon credits to clean it up. And by the way, the corporations should stay in control. Thanks, aliens. Appreciate it. That's that op. And of course, the way they present it is that Avi, we have to remember a couple of things about Avi. One is that he was in Talpiot for 12 years in Israel. So that's like, I was in the CIA and then I went and moved to Israel. So he was in Talpiot over there doing all that stuff for them, including undercover work, and then came over here. So, that's a lot of intel insider piece. So the idea that he became ordained as the scientist who was to come out and give us, UFO disclosure, and the fact that he pays attention to the whole Oumuamua thing and really overemphasizes that as an event, along with that emphasis around AI, gives us what his op is, which is, hey, it's science. It's the UFO science thing, because the threat op was really clumsy. And I think people like Christopher Mellon and Elizondo dropped the ball on that several times. It's interesting because, Greenwald, who does the Black Vault, was saying that he checked on Elizondo's book, which suddenly, the whole thing around that has disappeared. And he checked the publisher and they were like, oh, there's no publication date. And I noticed that Leslie Kean, who was doing a whole special with him and DeLong and all these people, and CNN was like, we're doing a 5-part special on UFOs. It's all gone. That whole thing is scrapped. And then, you hear little things once in a while, like it hasn't been scrapped. It's just, in delay in production. It doesn't work that way. Something has held up these things. That piece of the operation has been held up. So we'll see. It looks to me like what they're doing is they're handing the baton off to Nolan, who is not going to go, on Twitter and say, oh, your mom is a hooker, like Elizondo was doing with people. I mean, Elizondo, I think, represents a real low in the whole UFO field, starting off with the idea that, he was an ex-Pentagon officer. He was never ex anything because he was with the government the whole time. And now he admits that he works for the government now. So there's no ex anything. There's no whistleblower. It's just, he was part of this CIA UFO threat op. That didn't come off, but the dangerous elements and pieces around it concern me greatly. And I'm going to bring them to the fore here tonight. Let's start with this Ukrainian UFO thing and Avi Loeb's role in it. Are you ready? All right. Ukrainian astronomers claim UFOs spotted in skies above Kiev. The paper has divided these so-called UFOs into 2 types, cosmic and phantom. That's interesting too. It has, however, made no reference about the ongoing war. These are the headlines that are coming out, and these aren't fly-by-night newspapers. These are some of the main newspapers. This is Jerusalem Post. Okay. Are there UFOs, UAPs in the skies of Ukraine? Study says yes. Okay. Number of UFO, UAPs were discovered over the skies in Ukraine, according to this non-peer reviewed studies. But what they say and what they are isn't clear. Okay, so this is coming through the whole cosmic phantom UFO piece. Another one, India Times, cosmic and phantom UFOs seen all over Ukraine skies. And it's interesting because here's another one. Cosmic and phantom UFOs are all over Ukraine skies, government report claims. And so that's another BBC report. So we have all the major newspapers lining up with this story of UFOs over the Ukraine, which seems kind of bizarre on the face of it. I mean, you know, you're going to see UFOs in the middle of a war zone between Russia and Ukraine. Well, interestingly enough, there was a signature right off the bat with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that was when this really sophisticated plane that was flying out of Russia crashed in a portion of Russia, which was the scene of a major UFO landing in 1989. And the thing was so hardcore at the time that Nightline with Ted Koppel covered it. And it made every major newspaper. And this is the idea that this craft came down, it landed, and actually that beings came out. But it had something like, 50, 60 witnesses in a park, including a police chief. So this is a really hard one to blow off. So this plane had gone down right in that same town where this strange thing had happened. That was the first UFO signature around it. The other weird signature, and again, that UFO nukes thing keeps coming up this year, but the UFO nuclear combination came up again when right off the bat, there was something in relation to Chernobyl around the Ukraine war. So, we're right in the middle of these strange signatures relating back to the 80s and kind of unfinished business relating to the nukes and UFO file back then. That was the signature right off the bat. So now here we are with the Ukraine situation, and we have Harvard's top alien hunting astronomer has an explanation for UFOs spotted above Ukraine, and it is our friend Avi Loeb. There he is, putting this forward. Harvard's top alien hunting astronomer has an explanation for UFOs spotted above Ukraine. So here he is inserting himself into this story, which I find interesting right off the bat. Loeb leads a team of scientists looking for evidence for alien technology. Yeah, but did you know that half that board are sent to CIA agents? So they're CIA people, including Mellon and Elizondo. So, this whole, they're scientists. The whole Galileo project is infested with intelligence people. And so that's a problem right away. If it was just a bunch of scientists, I would be very interested to see what they came up with. But unfortunately, that whole thing is controlled by intelligence people. So what he's saying is, the scientists may be observing artillery shells. So they're trying to play this off. But I'm going to get into really old case histories in relation to UFO activity around war zones relating to Russia. But let's just read a little bit of this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X series. We're going tonight on the X State of the Union, and we're covering the UFO file, the key to the UFO file. We're going to go, let's see, we'll go to about 11 tonight, and the last half hour we'll save for your questions. Miss Olivia is taking those now. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Gawillamon says UFOs in war zone could easily suggest undisclosed military tech. Kate Schneider says this nuclear war fiasco could be the perfect excuse for a sudden UFO threat intervention.
Yes.
And Esther Taylor says they are exploiting UFOs as their scapegoat.
Oh, wow.
That's a really good theory.
Yeah.
Because whatever they do, they can just blame on the UFOs.
This is true. Suddenly, it's okay to talk about UFOs when reporting in a war zone. Probably the first war ever, even though it's happened. Look, the Foo Fighters, that's from World War II when American pilots were flying over Germany. These things would show up behind them, these lights that could do anything. So the original UFOs there are the Foo Fighters, but this is not something you'd see plastered in a headline. So this is representing part of the shift, which they want to integrate the idea of the UFO thing into the war zone. So those comments are right on the money from the Ideas Room. Thank you. In September, Ukrainian astronomers published a report detailing what they thought were unexplained aerial phenomena, flying over the war-torn region. Now, alien hunting, he's not alien hunting, come on. As Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb has weighed in on the science out of Kiev. Oh, yes, science. So he's saying Loeb is the head of the Galileo project. I'm going to tell you, as I read this article, there's going to be a piece in here. There's an absolute mind blower and shows us how this is being coordinated. And I actually think it's a slip of the tongue by Loeb, and how it got out, I don't know. Loeb is the head of the Galileo project at Harvard University, a program that uses scientific rigor to search for evidence of extraterrestrial life and technology. He's the former chair of the school's astronomy department. He's gathered accolades, and they go through this thing, half a page stuff about how great Avi Loeb is. It's like the Honorable Avi Loeb. Loeb told Motherboard on the phone that people constantly ask him to comment on unidentified aerial phenomena. You mean UFOs? He claimed the authors of the initial paper out of Kiev had contacted him with their work, but that he hadn't looked at it. The skies above Kiev, Loeb said, are the last place people should be looking for UAPs right now. It's kind of weird. In science, we're trying to administer the noise so we can pick up the signal, and so on, he goes. Ukraine is at war. During a war, there's lots of stuff flying through the sky. Yeah, thank you for that. But everything changed when Sean Kirkpatrick, the newly appointed head of the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Remember, this is AARO, Project Blue Book Redux 2022, that's getting thrown out at the end of the year, and they have a new one coming in, headed up again by the DNI. It's going to have a new name and the whole thing for 2023, and Stepford Biden is going to sign on the dotted line on December 31st when they ship out the new NDAA. But anyway, everything changed when Sean Kirkpatrick, the newly appointed head of the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, showed up at Loeb's home, he said, and asked him to look into the phenomena of UAPs. According to Loeb, Kirkpatrick didn't mention the Kiev report specifically. Loeb recalled it later that evening and decided to work through its observation in the morning. Within an hour, he concluded they got the distance to their dark objects wrong by a factor of 10. Okay, so Kirkpatrick is the head of the UAP task force. He now is the head of AARO. And this guy has a very interesting background as well. But the idea of him in DC running AARO and then just showing up at Loeb's house, who lives, close to me up here, that's kind of weird. So what do you do? Just drop in on this guy's house? That struck me as a little bit odd. And it also raises the question about who's calling the shots about what these people can say, because were they afraid Loeb was going to spill his guts? And why not call him up and say, hey, I'm heading over. So you just show up at his house and you kind of go over this Ukraine report with him. That whole scenario feels weird to me. I'd like to see him explain how that relationship works. The Ukrainian UAP paper identified two kinds of objects it labeled phantoms and cosmics. Phantoms were dark objects and cosmics were luminous. He focused on the phantoms at first because if they're dark, it means they're blocking light and probably in Earth's atmosphere. The paper suggested these phantoms were 3 to 12 meters in length. According to Loeb, an object fits that description would cause an incredible disruption. A huge fireball, Loeb said. According to Loeb, the energy released by such an object would be equivalent to the amount of energy consumed by everyone on Earth. He's using all of these, he's sort of dismissing their reports and not giving us much in the place of it, just to say, oh, their calculations are wrong. They're out. So they sent him in to get rid of this, which makes me wonder what those things really are up there. Objects moving through space displace the matter around them. When a bullet leaves a gun, it displaces air when a jet goes faster, and so on. Loeb believes the explanation of phantom UAVs, now we have not UAP, but UAV in Ukraine, is something much more common during the war. It could be artillery. So we've got that whole thing about him inserting himself into the middle of that, but also the reports themselves and the strange bit about Kirkpatrick coming over his house. Right off the bat, that's getting us into weird territory. And Stepford Biden would lead the charge and get things even stranger, believe it or not. let's get that one. All right. So Biden comes out and he's talking about all the different things going on in relation to Russia and Ukraine, and out of the blue says this is the first time to face the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, I mean, you had the whole Reagan era. What was that? They weren't tap dancing. Those were pretty dangerous encounters that we had with Reagan during the whole Cold War. And, this idea of suggesting Armageddon from the presidential podium is just bizarre. It's almost like they're enjoying the scenario somehow. And, it was Reagan who called the Soviets the evil empire. And, we had tons of nuclear Armageddon movies like Mad Max and stuff in the 80s. I mean, certainly, so this is like a weird excuse to use Armageddon and also to cash in on the fact that it was President Kennedy, in fact, who ended the nuclear standoff 60 years ago, coming up later this October. So, we're in an interesting situation there where they're throwing around words like that. And then we have Zelensky, and he's saying, oh, I'm going to make myself a part of NATO. And by the way, don't wait till the Russians drop a nuke, preemptively take out their ability to do so, which basically puts the whole world into a nuclear conflagration. Thanks a lot, Zelensky. We go back 4 years, you were tap dancing in drag, and now you want the whole world to blow itself up. Kind of interesting. By the way, here's $100 billion by the end of the year. And, if those guys were solving things, if they were giving money to people on the ground in Ukraine and stopping that war, if they had a peace process, I don't even think people would worry about the money that was going over there. But it's the fact that it seems to be feeding this beast of a nuclear situation. And who's behind that? That's what we're going to get into next. A couple of interesting things that came up in relation to this. And I want to say that this is related before I leave the Ukraine piece. So Live Science, which tends to pick up on these things and be a mouthpiece for, like Popular Mechanics, it's a mouthpiece for denouncing certain types of theories, like let's take down the 9/11 conspiracy theory. Let's take down UFOs. But on this, they're very interesting. The skies over Kiev, they say, are swarming with unidentified flying objects, according to a new report from the main astronomical observatory at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Of course, given that Russia and Ukraine have been locked in months-long war that relies heavily on aircraft and drone, it's likely that many of these so-called UFOs are military tools that appear too fleetingly to identify. So this is interesting too, because of course, we've had all kinds of air battles before. I mean, the Iraq War had tons of air battles, et cetera, and they didn't have all these UFO reports. So no, it's a little bit different. And so it seems to me that there is something that's operational there, which is unusual, different, and that people on the ground, military and civilian, have not seen before. That's where the reports are coming from. And that's why the initial reports by the scientists saying, oh, I have a report on this, these people are seeing this and that, are the more accurate and the more honest. And the follow-up things from people like Loeb and Live Science are to bring it down and say, oh, no, it's just artillery or whatever, which, they've seen artillery over there. How many different types of skirmishes have taken place? So, the CIA basically did a coup there just a few years ago. So, the way that I look at it, there's something very interesting going on. But the researchers came out with this original report, and they did have very strong evidence for UFO activity. And the researchers did not speculate as to what these UFOs may be. Rather, their paper focuses on the methods and calculations used to detect the objects. This is important because, the whole situation around the war with Ukraine and Russia and drawing the United States into it, and how it's a proxy war for the CIA to drive, the Russians to the edge, and the Russians having their own, delusions of grandeur. So there's problems on both sides going on here. But the use of unusual technology in the middle of it and the threats of nukes to counteract it and the kind of normalizing of the nuclear discussion is something that needs to be brought out, because it seems to me I'll read it this way, that the Russians know and the Americans know about UFO activity, and that each knows that each one has a UFO reproduction, recycling, redevelopment program. And so the things that we're seeing there about UFO activity is one side or the other signaling we have this and we're using it. And the other side, in this case, Russia, saying us using nukes is not a bluff. So on our side, we can say, oh, well, we're not suggesting that we'll use nukes, but somehow there's a provocation in the middle of all this. And it's hard to say exactly who or where it's coming from, but it seems to be playing out somewhere in that X-Protect realm of the UFO file. And that's where the nuclear question even comes up, because they're saying somewhere in the Kremlin, if you turn that UFO activity on us, we're ready with nukes. So, and then the American response is very strange. The American response is, hey, we're buying a bunch of radiation pills as if it's inevitable that this is going to happen. That was weird when they spent $290 million on radiation pills and stockpiling that. You know, it gives everyone a very uneasy feeling. And then you have Stepford Biden wandering around saying like, oh, this is like Armageddon. I mean, you're the president of the United States. So, you know, where's the diplomacy, et cetera? So I wanted to bring us into the situation of the last major nuclear standoff of the Cold War during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how President Kennedy handled it, to show us, you know, what sanity looks like even in unreal, insane situations, and how different that is from the no peace process, the bellicose rhetoric, and the reasons behind that. We're going to get into that now. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist. X State of the Union. Tonight is the UFO file key. Is the UFO file right now the key to everything that we're seeing on the ground? Well, I'll tell you, in large part, it appears to be the case. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the show, and we're going to go for like another hour tonight. And it's great to be with everyone. Of course, we just did the Millie Weaver interview last night, and we have that out there for you. There's a lot of great revelations in there from Millie's work, including around Mar-a-Lago and the raid, which I'm going to get into tonight as well. But before I go any further, you're up.
Vito Sarazzi, quote, in the near future, we must prepare to encounter the unimaginable, unquote. That's from the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, 2 days ago.
He's got the right idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think he meant by that?
Real good question. There seems to be a lot of that, right? Like, oh, we need to get rid of we need to get used to this whole new normal of everything being a freak show. Well, there's going to be such an emphasis around the UFO file for this State of the Union. And there's a few things in relation to that. I got into Earth Changes last week. Land rising is a big piece of how this State of the Union should work. We should understand that there are earth changes that are coming that are related to things like pole shifting, but the pole shift is not a cataclysmic activity. At this juncture, it is a gradual change. And they're aware of it, and they're trying to do things to position themselves properly. And the average person on the ground is not aware of these things, which is why I believe so many of the mystery schools left behind that legacy. And we have that echo through the work of people like Edgar Cayce telling us there's a lot of earth changes that are coming. Part of that was about land rising. And, I want us to take that into account, which is, we hear so much, oh, there's climate change and water rising and all the rest. And as we know, there's a lot of inconsistencies with that. It's actually a very mixed situation, and they're using this. But in relation to water submerging land is rising also, and that's the key piece that the mystery schools have left there. So I've been talking about it and trying to put it out there. And now we're getting actual physical evidence for it, and the stories are coming forward about islands rising in the Pacific. And this type of activity we're going to see more of. This is all of the activity that Cayce had mentioned in relation to Bimini, and how that piece that once was Atlantis is now rising up. And we're going to see what those islands looked like, because there's a large-scale change that's going on. Getting ahead of that and understanding what it is going to give us a real, it's going to help us and get us on an even keel dealing with the people who are creating policy on the leadership level, scientifically, politically, economically, and even spiritually in the real world now. And part of the problem is disconnecting from the public and the people on the ground and just, moving forward and creating a kind of a schizophrenic situation between the people on the ground and the leadership that creates a cycle of disrespect. And so now we don't trust them, and they're trying to move fast past any idea of people voting on things. There's no debate over anything. It's just, here, insert this chip in your head and become our slave. It's for your own good and it's for the environment. And people are very wise to this, from the you're going to eat bugs to, sit at home and get a UBI and don't work and don't have any dreams, of advancing from your position. They don't want the competition. And this is, I think, a very important piece of this. But the part I want to emphasize really on that is that they're aware that land is rising. So if land rises, and specifically now off the East Coast of America in the Atlantic, that's where the major portion rises. I've pointed out in a series of Hot Zone episodes that a number of people, from Ernest Hemingway to John Lennon, were engaged in buying lots in the Atlantic Ocean, and that actually Ernest Hemingway's brother, Lester, started New Atlantis out there in the Hot Zone, and created a nation and all the rest of it. But the idea is, when this land comes up, it'll be in international waters, and it can be anybody's new country. And a lot of people were really geared up for this. They were too early. They were the early adopters. But we are now in the time zone for this, and these people are very aware of it, and it's a key part of their thinking, which is why they're trying to put us in this kind of climate slavery, climate slave scenario. So that's something we need to be aware of right off the bat. And the UFO piece, we're going to see how this relates, because they need the UFO threat piece at first. And this is a control piece, because if you can get a UFO emergency, you can rule the globe through emergency powers. And this is the road that these people are on. As fantastic as it sounds, we've seen the evidence on the ground. And after all, if they were willing to do it with a, quote, disease, well, they're certainly willing to do it with the UFO file. I want to go back to this again, because this is the thing that happened next week, when last week they went through this whole thing about this logo that came out for this intelligence outfit associated with the aviation. And it's the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence for Aviation, and they put a UFO in their logo. And we remember this whole scandal from a week ago, and everyone going up and down about this. And, you had the likes of Corbell saying, like, oh, this is, a Bob Lazar breakthrough to try to sell his movie. And, Elizondo was like, oh, this is thanks to all my efforts and all that stuff. And I salute the brave men and women on the inside, totally unreal, just scenarios. And then suddenly it got pulled. The logo was gone. There was no explanation, etc. And what we were left with was the Popular Mechanics explanation about it. Now, remember, Popular Mechanics was left there to try to dumb down the public about what really happened during 9/11. And their explanations were absolutely ridiculous. And there are so many ridiculous stories around 9/11, and just the basic outline of this guy in a cave controlling everybody with a satellite phone, while a group of guys with box cutters take down an air defense system that was built to survive a nuclear attack. It's not very likely to happen. Neither is a passport likely to come out of the top of a building after, the person who had the passport was on the plane and crashed into one of the Twin Towers. And then that passport goes down from the building and lands on a pile of rubble for an FBI agent to pick up and identify who the hijackers are. It's not a very plausible explanation. I'm sorry. So, but 9/11 became the signature thing that Popular Mechanics was like, we're going to drill home that, Building 7 fell on its own, and that's the way science works. So they're often used in this role for how to, cover things up. So there's the cover from Popular Mechanics, and it is UFO somehow ended up on a U.S. intelligence agency logo. The agency says it was a mistake, but how did this flying saucer logo get uploaded in the first place? So there's a lot of things that were going
That
on.
is absurd.
Yeah, think about it. This is a trial balloon beyond trial balloon, and they were able to gauge everybody's reaction and also create a fiction, which we're going to get into. But yeah, I mean, weren't you sensing that? You could sort of feel the hint out there was that there's a hoax thing with them taking this down. U.S. intelligence agency, the National Intelligence Manager for Aviation, NIMA, recently posted a new eye-catching logo on its website that included a UFO on it. There also appeared to be a second, slightly different UFO adorned logo further down the webpage and used as a background image. Now, so the excuse has been, oh, somebody on the inside did that. It was a joke, haha, and it's gone. So it doesn't work that way because of the nature of the office, because it's an intelligence office, unless they were hacked somewhere, and there's nothing about that in here. The office was one of the government groups that last year drafted a highly anticipated UFO report. So they were deep in the soup of this thing. The U.S. intelligence agency has removed a tongue-in-cheek logo or two, tongue-in-cheek, from its website following news that it included a flying saucer. Until early Tuesday morning, the website for the National Intelligence Manager for Aviation, which advises the head of U.S. intelligence on aviation matters. It's no small office. Briefly opened up a logo, sported a logo that included a Turkish drone, a Russian jet fighter, and a UFO. The agency has since removed the logo and has hardly mentioned that its purview includes all threats to aviation, presumably including possible ET threats. So there's a lot of weird thing. They get to kind of have their cake and eat it too here. Here's some of the spin out of this, right? So first, you get the data mining operation of what happens when you put this out there and how does that UFO community react. 1. 2, you get the phony thing that people like Lou can say, like, oh, these brave people on the inside put that logo there because they're fighting the good fight of me as a whistleblower. I'm doing the same thing, even though I work for the government. So, we have that whole thing. And then the other piece that they have is they're getting both the ability to say, oh, there might be some secret group on the inside that's trying to get the truth out in the government. So that the whole thing becomes government and then people who are pretending not to be in the government, like Elizondo, saying, oh, I'm cheering on those heroes in the government, that I'm also in the government too. So what we're getting is a weird symbiotic strangeness that's going on with that. And they get to basically pump this up, data mine it, use it for marketing purposes, and also just kind of not commit to having it out there. But also, they're bringing in this idea of a threat. So now let's go with the phony group that's inside that wants the truth out, and those heroes are fighting to get the truth out. Okay. That is the whole thing that got laid out through the CIA 5 years ago with the TTSA and Semivan. That's the CIA op, which is that there were people on the inside who wanted to get this out. And they went through this whole thing with tearjerker Lou saying that, I'm a whistleblower and, this office doesn't represent me. And now here's the truth. And there's so many holes in that story. And we've done enough coverage, I think, on TTSA to give you an idea for that. But just fundamentally, that the Tic Tac videos that they were releasing were already released on YouTube in 2007. So, that's the level of the high secret and top secret stuff they were putting out there. That's not that impressive, especially if it had already been out there. So when we see the same group running around with Loeb, we know that the op has switched and now it's become the UFO Silence AI op. And the dangers with that one are that they're going to try to present these credentialed people, and the people in the media like Tucker Carlson, like Megyn Kelly and CNN and all the rest of it, people like Tucker or Megyn Kelly can do stories that are pretty good and pretty investigative. But the problem is they don't know anything about UFOs. And I've stressed this before, which is it's a really big disconnect. The same thing with Rogan. And if you don't have that knowledge of the UFO thing and you just have a bunch of CIA people filling you in and informing your world, then you're running into problems. So in this picture, you've got these guys going into the New York Times office. That's Elizondo's semi-van. And over here is Chris Mellon. And Mellon, of course, worked for Bush in intelligence. And Elizondo, as we know, counterintel. Semi-van is the one I want you to really pay attention to. And that's this guy, because he's CIA top level 25 years. Okay. He organized and was the VP of the To the Stars Academy. The whole thing, that entire operation comes directly out of the Central Intelligence Agency. Those are the people that presented the UFO threat up. Yeah, what happened?
Renner Newton said Three Stooges.
Unfortunately, yeah. And the New York Times ran with it. And what you have 5 years later is a complete waste. Like they suck the oxygen out of the UFO field. Nothing else could happen while this stuff was going on. And now everywhere you go is that dumb, grainy Tic Tac thing, which is not a UFO, whatever it is, and whatever they created with it. So that's what we got stuck with. Now let's go back to the real UFO file research. So now we have this whole thing that's taken place in Ukraine, and we see, the UFO piece has been moved, and they had these hearings back there in May. And in those hearings, as I've pointed out, one of the kind of dicey exchanges was all about how they want to punish amateur interest groups. And they really need ideas about how to do that. And, we had the Defense Department officials saying, I'll get back to you about that, Congressman. I know we have to get together and figure out how to punish those amateur interest groups. So you pick up a UFO book and, you're persona non grata, quite frankly. So there's more on the popular mechanics side, but I think that gives the snapshot there, which is they're basically, running this through, and they're playing cover for this weird incident that took place where they put this UFO on the logo. And now when I look at this, I have to say to myself, put it together with what we were seeing about the Ukraine reports. And they're starting to normalize the UFO as part of the foreign policy discussion. So I want us to get into and connect that thinking now, keeping in mind the UFO file, keeping in mind Ukraine and these other things, and put it together with the Mar-a-Lago raid and the files that were taken there, excuse me, and the original gestation of the secrecy around the UFO file. That's where we're going next. And like I said, we'll save the last half hour for your questions. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Thomas Bessler was asking, considering Avi Loeb discredited the report after being asked by the head of the DoD UFO department, does it make the report more real?
Well, that's interesting. It does, because I believe that Loeb is just operating on, he's the AI science person. So his goal is to make it so that you think that the UFO thing is driven by AI, et cetera. He's not in with the UFO threat camp. The Elizondo people and all that stuff they tried, that was all about getting an office that was dedicated because of a threat. So they created a threat. But what's more sinister behind the creation of an office, defense contracts, and all the rest of it is the idea that creating a UFO emergency, you get into a whole emergency powers situation, and you have people bartering and saying, what can we get from consolidating a UFO emergency? So it gets us into interesting territory. But if anything, I would say that the premise of the question is correct, because Loeb is somebody who, dealing with the AI side of it, he doesn't want to play into the scientists in the Ukraine and all the rest saying, look, we have these UFO reports going on there. He's not part of it. So he's sent in there to debunk it. And we can reason why, but I think it is pretty clear that he's the agent who's to take their research and make it look like it's not sensible.
He also is dependent on their money. on their funding.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of interesting trails with his funding. And, you know, his association with Christopher Mellon is quite fascinating. I think that's going to open up also. All right, let's go down an interesting journey to the root of the UFO file and see if the UFO file key is related to the earliest aspect of this. This goes into an interesting comment by a different Greenwald, not our Black Vault friend, but Glenn Greenwald, who was, you know, well known for his efforts breaking the Snowden story and creating The Intercept and then leaving and starting his own thing. And he used to be, you know, the traditional left and then the woke left thing. You know, they like to take guys like him who are the traditional left and Taibbi and people like that and say, oh, you're useful idiots for Russia. This is their new thing because they won't toe the line. So that's the real kind of fascinating thing, which is the neocon piece moved in behind the woke group and started to take the traditional liberals and their love for peace and other things and just kind of get those guys aside. All right, so there's a couple interesting comments here. Greenwald's comments about the leaders of the U.S. intelligence community at the end of Trump's term. This is quite fascinating, and there's a Zero Hedge story about this, and also Greenwald's story, and then also the work around a JFK researcher named Jefferson Morley. So I'll try to tie them all three in together here. Everyone, you're watching the X State of the Union. We'll go about another hour here, and we'll get to your questions in the last half hour. Okay. This is the quote from Glenn Greenwald now. They were very afraid of Trump, the intelligence community, on his way out, that he was going to do a bunch of stuff, including not just giving pardons to Snowden and Assange, but declassifying all kinds of stuff he'd been threatening to declassify about the CIA, about the Kennedy assassination. Now think about this for a moment. There were whispers through Jack Posobiec, who's a conservative commentator, you know, has a big Twitter downline, etc. But he tends to hear those things on the inside relating to the White House in that period, especially. So on the way out, he was hearing, and I've pointed this out, that Trump was going to reveal the UFO file and the Kennedy assassination files around the CIA. Now, I want to point out a couple of things about this as background. One is that Judge Andrew Napolitano said that he talked to President Trump when he was supposed to release those files on October 26, 2017, and that Napolitano was shocked that the CIA had talked him out of it and that he had basically released some kind of fluff documents instead. And that Trump's response as president to Napolitano was, if you saw what was in there, you couldn't. And Napolitano said, well, don't treat the public like children. You know, if it's the law, let it out. And then Trump saying, Andrew, you don't understand. Like, if you saw it, you couldn't let it out. Like, this stuff cannot get out. So whatever it is on a very high level. This has been talked about for years because there was always the idea, oh, there's nothing in those files. The CIA would have edited it out, etc. Now, there's an interesting backlog to this, which is that RFK, upon hearing of his brother's assassination, called the CIA director to his farm in Virginia, and they had a meeting, which no one ever knew the content of it. But basically, Kennedy said after that they'll never be able to lie to us about it. Now, this is very interesting, and it set up the idea that somehow in those records, there's a booby trap set up for the Central Intelligence Agency, and that is why they've taken all the heat all these years and made themselves look like a guilty party in relation to the Kennedy assassination by exactly acting and not letting those records out a year after year after year, passing legal deadlines and all the rest of it. Now, that's a law that they need to give those records back and out to the public. So, you know, this whole thing about, oh, Trump, he took these records and we're going to take him to court. Look, you might as well take the entire Central Intelligence Agency to court because they're sitting on records that belong to the public. How do we know that? Well, in 1992, a law was passed that said in 25 years, it's the law. Congress passed the law and the president signed it. President Bush signed it that you have to let these records out. So the fact that they haven't means they're in breach of the law, which is the same thing they're accusing President Trump of. So we're in a whole mess there with it. But the question is why? Why would you sit on that? If it's 60 years later, there's no one who's operational. There's no agent that was operating 60 years ago who's still acting like James Bond. It's just not going to happen. Some of those countries, like the Soviet Union doesn't even exist. And the leadership has changed. Cuba's, the whole map has changed. So why wouldn't you let it out? It begs the question, and then if you go further along the lines of dark journalism, it begs the question of the UFO file. And that's exactly where this goes, because Douglas Caddy, the Watergate lawyer on this program, went on the record and said, E. Howard Hunt, who was the top CIA guy, told him, because they were best friends, told him in private, what did he tell him? That Kennedy was assassinated because he wanted to share the UFO file. He was going to share it with the Russians. This is the key aspect, because each side has their own UFO program. And if they combine those, a lot of people in the middle get cut out. So whenever we've gone through history, first of all, with Kennedy, when he wanted to be in the room with just an interpreter with Khrushchev, the State Department hits the roof. The CIA hits the roof. President Reagan, I want to be alone at Reykjavik with Gorbachev. CIA, State Department, George Shultz, everybody goes nuts. Henry Kissinger. President Trump goes to do it with Putin. Oh, they call him a traitor. He's going to negotiate. He's a traitor to the United States. It's Russian collusion. Mueller spends $50 million in his probe and finds nothing to implicate Trump in collusion with Russia. So that shows the level of the tentacles of this group that I'm referring to, X-Protect, moving through these different channels of law, politics, the media. And they have a goal there, which is these two sides can't get together with their UFO programs, or the entire defense base in the middle gets cut out, especially the people who are hoarding that technology and are using it, and maybe using it also in a blackmail type sense. So I'm going to get into some of that piece here as we go along. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X State of the Union. We're going deep tonight on the UFO file and the key to the UFO file and how it relates to some of the weird things that we're seeing, like the raid at Mar-a-Lago, loose talk of nukes, Armageddon, you name it. We're going to be going here for another 45 minutes or so. We will take your questions. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Jordan Banner says, a friend suggested they are pushing the bugs, as this is what reptiles eat. They want humans to eat their food.
I wouldn't be surprised, for sure. Yeah, that whole thing, it's the ultimate like Frankenstein moment when it comes to food. I tend to, what happens, I think, when there's overreach like that is the public tends to react, and they really just go in a different direction. So you might be seeing a dramatic increase in local farms, local produce, or organic eating. And I think it's one of the reasons that Bezos got himself so deep in there with Whole Foods, because he wanted to control the whole food end of things. And I think that's why we're looking at Gates and his control of the largest amount of farmland in America. It's a very dangerous situation for those people because of their outlook and because of the amount of power dedicated to these small groups, just like we get with Elon. And don't think I've left Elon out of this X-steganography State of the Union. There's a big X-Elon piece coming up. And it's quite fascinating because it shows us through his own comments that the X-accelerant is on. It's on, baby. Okay, Christian Science Monitor. PhD says JFK asked CIA about UFOs. Now, I've given you my information about Douglas Caddy, a historical figure, a Watergate lawyer, saying on the record that the top CIA person, his best friend, who he worked with, not at the CIA, but at a publishing agency, and who he was the lawyer for, told him that Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. Now, this PhD said, well, JFK was asking questions. Well, he got the memo out of the Central Intelligence Agency through Freedom of Information request. And what Kennedy says in the memo dated November 12th is, as I've discussed with you previously, I've initiated and have instructed James Webb. You hear all about this James Webb telescope now. It's the same guy at NASA. And he said, I want to develop a process with the Soviets, the joint space and lunar exploration. It would be very helpful if you would give me the high threat UFO cases reviewed with the purpose of identification of bona fide as opposed to classified CIA and Air Force sources. And he's saying it's important that he wants the high threat cases. And the idea is that he wants to avoid any kind of nuclear incident in relation to a UFO going over a nuclear base, because they had those incidents. And he's basically saying, I don't want Khrushchev to think a UFO is America coming to bomb the Soviet Union. So he's making that request to the Central Intelligence Agency director on November 12th. Kennedy's assassinated 10 days later. And when we look at that sequence of events in relation, now we have the context of the Watergate lawyer saying it. And then we're seeing that Kennedy is initiating a joint space program. And those files, by the way, about the joint space program are on record at the Kennedy Library. And this memo, which came out through the Freedom of Information Act, was never challenged by the Central Intelligence Agency. And William Lester, who put it out, is the PhD who got it. He's never been challenged. So all those things are on record. They're not MJ12 documents. They're not the burned memo, which who the heck knows if that's even real. But these documents are solid, 100%. Kennedy asked them, I want all your high threat UFO cases, and I want to share them with our Russian counterparts. 1, 2, I want cooperation in outer space matters. Those things are on the record. And Khrushchev's son, Sergei, has gone on the record saying that Kennedy and Khrushchev had a pipeline in the background after the Cuban Missile Crisis because they got so close to exchanging nukes with each other that they wanted a channel to communicate outside of their generals and State Department, and that they used this channel to talk about, hey, let's do this. Let's go to the moon together. It's not going to be a space race. We're going to go into space together and develop this whole thing. Now, this is very interesting because the forces, here's where we understand the forces inside of NASA, the forces inside the space agencies that were Nazi and that were based on, they were holdovers from the Nazi space program. And that's how we got off the ground with our program. So instead of just saying, oh, well, there were a bunch of Nazis there, think of it this way. We had Nazi scientists who were responsible directly for the moonshot, and von Braun, et cetera. Just look at the work of Dr. Joseph Farrell. And in some cases, they maintained the exact same positions that they had during Nazi Germany. So, if they were in this capacity where one was the assistant, the other was the director, and all the rest, they maintained that entire structure. They brought it over with them to our space program. The Central Intelligence Agency was founded in major part from General Galen's incredible intelligence sweeps for the Nazis. He was their CIA guy before we had one. So there is this influence. It's not an overblown thing to state Nazis were deep in our space program and Nazis were deep in the setup of the CIA. It's an absolute historical fact. Now, the Russians, the Soviet Union also got their fair share of Nazis. So both sides took from the wealth of intelligence and technical know-how and talent that had been developed in Germany over the 20 years and the 12 years of the Nazi regime. So, and they were the leaders in tech at the time. So we were wise to take them and utilize them. The problem is that ideology crept in, and there was no way that these Nazis who had resided in our space program, so-called reform Nazis, that they would ever want to share this UFO technology with the Russians. This was their ultimate enemy. They had fought the Russians and killed 20 million of their people. So it gives us a little more background about that struggle and Kennedy making this unilateral decision. I'm not going to have a Cold War in space. It's not going to happen. We're going to have peace in space. It's going to be about scientific exploration, and we're going to establish treaties of no weapons in space. Well, that's the world that's upside down 60 years later because all they talk about is weapons in space. And if these guys want to exchange nukes over Ukraine, just imagine if they have, lasers and all the rest of it aimed at us from space. It's going to be a Frankenstein situation. It'll be dystopia 101. And so we have to remember this as we get into the various situations. Let's take a quick look, though, that can hook all of this up between the deep state and the UFO file researchers. Let's see if I can encapsulate this. Bobby Inman is the key figure in all this. Bobby Inman's still alive, and
Oh my God.
he is, and he's still, on the board of a number of these companies. And I'm sure when he was doing his stuff, as an admiral in the Navy and as the head of the NSA, as the deputy director of the CIA, he was following orders. I mean, this is the guy that they put in there for these hardcore deep state roles. And, it's never encapsulated around one person. So I'm not saying he's to blame for all this. As a matter of fact, in the late 1980s, Inman came out and started talking very openly about, one, we know exactly where the craft are coming from, and two, we know exactly who's inside operating them. That's a big deal from a major official. So there was an attempt there at disclosure with this kind of disclosure. But here's the real interesting thing. There's a figure who was discovered in the middle of all this named George Joannides. And Joannides is quite important because he was in charge of psychological operations during the period of the Kennedy assassination for the Central Intelligence Agency. And he shows up in very unusual roles that were hidden. And he was discovered almost by accident, as he wasn't even known in history around this, anything to do with the JFK assassination. But he was in Florida and New Orleans running these groups for the CIA who were anti-Castro groups. And his object was to create the ultimate psychological weapon, and that was Oswald. And the idea of Oswald as this communist and all the rest of it, even though he was a right-wing guy who worked for Guy Bannister, who was the UFO file, the person who developed the UFO file. So Oswald was nothing like a communist. That was all a cover story. And he had developed this whole piece. Joannides is very crucial because when he was discovered by Jefferson Morley, who was a Washington Post reporter at the time, Morley was, and he went to his editors and they were like, oh, we don't want to touch this. And so he left and he did things on his own. But he found out through this background about this group called the DRE and how this group, the DRE, was funded largely through CIA efforts of Joannides. But then what's fascinating about Joannides, if you follow him, is that he becomes the liaison when the CIA gets in trouble in the 70s with the congressional committees researching the Kennedy assassination and the CIA's role in it. And so the agreement that gets struck between Congress and the CIA is we won't have anyone who's operational on the CIA side in 1963 with interacting with you guys in 1978, giving us this stuff now because they would have too much to lose. And so they make that deal. And then it turns out that Joannides becomes the middleman. And he says, oh, I had no role around Oswald or the Kennedy assassination or psych operations. I'm just going to be your intermediary. And he blocks them at every turn. The congressional committee at the end of it says, well, it's a 95% chance of a conspiracy. So we recommend to the Justice Department, you look into it. And then the CIA, the Reagan administration gets in, the CIA says, no way. And that's the end of that. But here's the rub on all this, which is the Joannides records were originally not even included in the records that were to be released under the JFK Records Act, because Joannides, no one even knew who he was. This is how hidden this guy was in the whole system. The trick to Joannides and Inman is you're going to get the JFK assassination and the UFO file piece together. And when people talk to Inman now, and I think he's like 90 years old, he comes out and talks once in a while, and he'll say things like, there were no UFOs. And he completely blanks out on all the things that he used to talk about in relation to the UFO thing. So he just stands there. And what the people who get a chance to interview him should do is mention the name of Joannides, because that will break the front. Here is Bobby Inman giving the Lifetime Achievement Award to Joannides, who managed what? The Oswald Project. So the person who managed the CIA assassination program for Central Intelligence Agencies, Joe Nitties here, is being saluted by the CIA through Bobby Inman. And he was what? The huge intermediary for the UFO file, saying, we know who's inside operating. There you have the crux between the deep state and the UFO file. That is the place or the area that the deep state intelligence researchers and the UFO file researchers can interact and relate, because they're going to have to at a certain point, because you have too much of a meetup there between those two different sides. If you can get the Joe Nitties records, by the way, it is the Joe Nitties records that are being kept under wraps. Hold on just a second. I think Joe Nitties is fogging my camera up. Miss Olivia, come on strong. What do you got?
You want a question?
Sure.
Okay, Bob Bindert. Has the telescope called Lucifer that the Vatican owns seen any new UFOs?
Good question. I'm sure they're going to get around to that. I'm absolutely positive that's where they're headed, in fact. And that's a weird one for sure. That's the one we're getting at. How are we doing out there? Is it all clear? Is it all clear? I think we're doing okay in relation to this. Yes. Go ahead, Miss Olivia.
Jay Vanderbest, do you think there are aliens working with the government? And Fred D. GJ, are the aliens ordering all this over-the-top secrecy?
Well, it's hard to say what the aliens are
What's
ordering.
your opinion?
It's a real good question, though. Well, I would say this, that on the level of secrecy, they realize that they have a real problem at this point, which is...
They say it's much better.
Oh, good.
Leave it.
It's good. Okay, actually, one last adjustment. Okay. Ta-da! I'm back. Right. See, that's the last time Joe Nitties will take over the camera. Let me say this in relation to all this, that we run into a situation where, we have on our side the understanding that the UFO file, it's an intergenerational piece. So we have families exchanging these stories. We have, peoples whose fathers were in World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, and saw these things. So you've got that level of intergeneration. Some people have lived and died studying the UFO piece. And so we have, a very human aspect to this and the understanding of it in our own consciousness. We don't need the government for that. So, as society has developed, we've had these UFO incidents, the crashes, the things that they couldn't explain away. And basically what they ended up doing was they decided, well, what we're going to do is we're just going to, at first they would talk about it. You even can go back to like 1950 and find interviews with Harry Truman saying, well, there are these UFOs, but they don't seem to be disturbing our airspace. So it's not a national security threat. So like no big deal, basically. And behind the scenes creating a massive secrecy infrastructure to study the real thing while he's playing it down in public. That's just the way that things were. But what happened was the whole secrecy piece became a country of itself. So once you combine the secrecy around the UFO file with the people who are developing the continuity of program underground bunkers to fend off a nuclear attack, they became an authority unto themselves, a world unto themselves, not accountable to the group that was above, the public policy group. So you had the overt command structure on the top, the regular public structure that we understand, and then the covert side. And at a certain point, the covert side just took over, and the crisscross occurs during the Kennedy assassination. When you look at the Kennedy assassination, when you look at the factors around it, you can see that the most important thing, Kennedy had gotten into so many different areas, but the most important piece is that he's thwarting the CIA authority over all this. And that's the crucial aspect. So when we look at it from beyond that point, we're looking at, a much different situation. We're looking at them holding a certain edge in medicine and science in all of these different kind of areas. and the public being completely out of the loop and them kind of enjoying the situation being that way. So I think on our side, we have to see that this has been, a really interesting experiment, which is what happens when a small group controls all of the reality that's going on. Unconsciously, the public still knows. We still have that understanding, but we get brainwashed from the top down about what the official reality is. And the struggle now is that the official reality and the public's knowledge on the ground is so far apart that the authorities are looking at us and saying they know too much, basically, fundamentally. And so this is part of the problem that we've run into. So I think that the wall of secrecy, they're looking at ways of faking out that they're giving you what's behind the wall of secrecy while still maintaining that wall more hardcore than ever. So that's, I think, maybe a good answer. Do you have another one?
Yeah, Bo Krills is asking, I've read that early U.S. intelligence was basically a U.S. Navy domain. Does DJ think military intelligence is still relevant, or has the civilian agencies, have they taken the baton?
Well, in relation to the UFO file, it's X-Protect that controls it, and they operate in the shadowy corridor between the defense contractors and the Central Intelligence Agency on one side, and on the other side, we have, the government apparatus, the regular government apparatus, and then you have the corporate interests, so Lockheed Martin and all the rest. So if you've got defense contractors who are part of the government, contracting to the government, but are still allowed as independent companies to keep their secrets, then they're a much better place to reside that level of secrecy as opposed to something that's subject to FOIA, for example. So we have to look at it that way, and also remember that what's happening is it's hold the secrecy at all costs, even if you have to give out a fake version of what's going on. So if I give you the false version of what's going on, then you think you're getting the real deal, and somehow that gap between the official reality and the reality on the ground doesn't seem so far away. The problem is you're adding secrecy upon secrecy, and that this is what happens. It inevitably has to blow up, because what you're getting is these people holding more and more power and control and advantage in smaller and smaller clusters. And the imbalance of that, too much power at the top makes what? It makes it top heavy. And what happens when something is top heavy? It topples over. So they've been trying to control the topple. And so we have to prepare ourselves for that level of destruction. And I like one of the things that Catherine Fitz said in relation to this was, she said, well, it appears to me that, it's like Berlin. Look at Berlin after the war, World War II. If you look at those incredible footage of this destroyed metropolis, then we have to be ready to pick up after the fact, and this is the level of the nature of the things that we're talking about. I'm going to wrap up the Joe Anidis section here, which is JFK files 15-year lawsuit over mysterious CIA agent drags as final files await release. This is important. There's Joe Anidis again. And the case was brought by Jefferson Morley, who was the former Washington Post reporter I mentioned earlier. And so what we have is, for 15 years, author and assassination expert Jefferson Morley has fought to compel the CIA to produce records about longtime spy George Joe Anidis, who worked with a group associated with President John F. Kennedy's alleged assassin, and then aided the committee, aided the committee that tried to investigate that killing. Aided is really funny because he was blocking all the records. But the upshot is that every time that Morley, and Peter Dale Scott joined this case as well, brought the case forward, over and over again, the CIA would win. And actually, finally, it was Judge Kavanaugh, who's now a Supreme Court justice, who just slammed it. You're out. But to see all those factors involved brings me back again to what Greenwald said, which is that Trump had taken the JFK assassination files to Mar-a-Lago with him. Does it start to kind of resonate a little bit more when we see what's at stake? And also, does their reaction to that and learning about that Because when you have the JFK files, are you then sitting directly on the UFO file as a result? Because after all, the Central Intelligence Agency assassinated the president over the UFO file. Well, then that opens up a few things. So if Trump has that at Mar-a-Lago, then they're going to risk anything to get it. Now, I want to get into a few things around this with Trump in relation to it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep here on the X State of the Union, and we've already taken a couple of your questions. Great action in the ideas room tonight. And Miss Olivia, how are you doing?
I'm exhausted.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, no, there's been a whole everybody wants to see me.
Oh, so, yeah, right.
You know, and enough.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, you know. You kind of
I can't.
You set
I
your own
cannot
terms
do
on
what
that.
I do and be on camera. I just can't. I have
Fair
enough to
enough.
focus on.
Look, you know, Olivia's ace as it is, and if she wants to be seen, let me tell you, she'll be out there.
God. It doesn't matter whether I'm hot or not. it's like she's hot. She sounds hot.
She sounds hot.
I'm wearing overalls. I'm not hot.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Look, the way I look at this is, you know, it's much better to just kind of be in your own comfort zone when you're doing this kind of work. That is for sure.
Thank you.
But you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Here we go. X series now. We're going deep here. What do you got?
It was like Frank said, overalls can be hot. They can. Mine aren't.
That's great. What about my DJ pin? That's
right. Let's talk about you being hot.
That's on my jacket there. That looks pretty good. All right. Trump says he's heard very interesting things about Roswell, site of an alleged UFO event. Now, here's Trump laying it out. Just, you know, I've heard interesting things. This is at the end of his presidency. Okay. So no problem talking the UFO file and rolling it out there. Trump's uncle, of course, being the person who worked with Nikola Tesla and getting those records. And, you know, he was the one who got called in to study Nikola Tesla's papers. Now, it's very important that we stop here and consider something, which is why was he called in the first place? And this is important because it was Vannevar Bush who set him up through the FBI, and they had something, the Alien Effects Office at the time, an alien meaning someone who was from another country. And he got selected for the job because he was Vannevar Bush's protege. What we learned later through top physicists that had worked on the UFO file was that Vannevar Bush was in charge of all of it. He was the main man in relation to the UFO file. His protege was John G. Trump, Trump's uncle. So Trump's uncle knew everything that there was to know about the UFO file and about the X technology through the Tesla work. He had both. Therefore, when Trump, as a billionaire real estate developer, starts to muse, I can be president, he's not an average threat. He's not the threat of like the Bushes versus the Clintons, because at the end of the day, they're both on the same team anyway. The problem there goes deep. And the problem is that he knows about the UFO file. He knows where those UFO bodies are buried. And if he has that piece, then it helps to explain the absolute freaked out contagion around Trump and how every media person was willing to lose face to go after him, and they were willing to lie and all the rest of it. However you feel about Trump as a media or political figure, it doesn't matter. What we're trying to get to is who knows what, and what are the levels at which they're controlling the situation on the ground. Now, one of the things that John G. Trump said was, you know, it was really strange. The thing that they wanted the most from the Tesla papers, and they wanted me to research, was concerned something that could take down flying objects at a great distance. So, for example, I'm sitting in California, I press a button, and a plane goes down over the UK. The fact that he mentioned flying objects there is very important. Now, in a book called Contactees by Nick Redfern, he talks about George Adamski. George Adamski was very related in the background to the work that Thomas Townsend Brown was doing. And in fact, Townsend Brown's daughter told me about a sighting and a landing that took place at their Virginia farm. And it was the landing of these Adamski-style craft. And that T.T. Brown had some kind of relationship with them. T.T. Brown, we've done some shows on, very important guy who had an ethical compass, even though he was operating with very deep black aspects of the American military industrial complex. So one of the things that happened, and I think it's interesting, is that he had gotten involved on projects and that Adamski had crisscrossed. And at a certain point, there's a picture of Thomas Townsend Brown, and he's standing next to a tube, and inside the tube is a small model of one of those Adamski craft in fluid. There's a few very interesting things around this also. There's a scientist who's working with both of them, and he ends up putting out a novel about a small group who fake an alien invasion in order to make both all these parties come to the peace table at the UN. It's quite interesting. But anyway, Nick Redfern goes back and talks about the fact of Adamski's interrogation by the FBI, and watch a few very interesting things come out. And remember that John G. Trump story that I just mentioned, that he said, oh, the FBI, the thing that they wanted out of the Tesla papers was that device that could take flying objects down with the press of a button. Adamski, in 1953, when the FBI was told that he had in his possession a machine which could draw flying saucers and airplanes down from the sky, the same exact thing. The FBI is looking for it here, and they're looking for it when they talk to John G. Trump in 1943. One can only imagine the consternation running throughout the corridors of power when this group, this bit of gossip surfaced. Not only was Adamski a devotee of commie aliens, he was now a potential threat to the airline industry too. Or was he? Although Adamski championed the idea that Russia will dominate the world and we will then have an era of peace for 1,000 years, he did express some concern that this aircraft-destroying machine might be used against American airplanes. As a result of wanting to make his position clear, Adamski decided to contact the U.S. authorities to reveal the truth. As a result, both agents of the FBI and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations met with Adamski on January 12, 1953. Maybe we should get Walter Bosley to comment on this, because that's his outfit, AFOSI. A worried Adamski tried to explain to the grim-faced agents that the device was actually the brainchild of someone else. And despite what the FBI might have heard to the contrary, Adamski had not had the opportunity to view the aircraft-destroying machine. He'd obviously heard about it. Adamski had not had the opportunity to view the aircraft-destroying machine, but in an effort to try and look patriotic and appease the FBI, Adamski admitted that he had enough awareness of the machine's creator to tactfully describe him as being, quote, not entirely loyal. The FBI document from 1953. That's what's cited. On this matter, at least, Adamski did cooperate with the Air Force and the FBI. In that same meeting, Adamski felt compelled to inform the agents of his encounter with Orthon. Whether this was merely the result of his ego or a desire to advise the agents of the alleged alien presence on Earth is unknown, but the FBI did not ignore what he had to say and prepared the following. Quote, this is from an FBI document. At a point, 2.10 miles, so 0.2 of a mile from Desert Center on the road to Parker and Needles, Arizona. There's Arizona again. Adamski made contact with a spacecraft and had talked to a spaceman. Adamski stated that he and his wife, Mary, had been out in the desert and that he and the persons that went with him had seen the craft come down into the earth. Adamski stated that a small stairway in the bottom of the craft, which appeared to be a round disc, opened and a spaceman came down from the steps. Adamski stated he believed there were other spacemen in the ship because the ship appeared translucent and he could see the shadows of other spacemen. So here's the first kind of major encounter that Adamski is describing. And Orthon comes down, and he's very Nordic looking. He's kind of a blonde angel type guy. And he tells him, oh, you know, you need to avoid nuclear Armageddon and inform people about peace. Now, what I want to mention here about Adamski also is that he comes out of the theosophical teaching, and he's deep on that. He leads groups in theosophy. So you have there the combination of the mystery school understanding with the space brother thing coming in. So the technology is now growing up, and somehow the mystery school knowledge has to combine with it. And Adamski, perfect or imperfect, is right in the middle of it. The person, it seems to me, that he's trying to say is not quite as patriotic as he should be is T.T. Brown. That's my guess. And that's the person he's sort of handing over to the FBI. But the machine that he discusses that can take down objects at a distance is the same thing that John G. Trump was looking for. And here we have an FBI report of someone who's seen a UFO and who's talking about this machine. Again, you cannot get around the idea that this technology was around and someone knew about it, and that these are the types of stories and these are the offshoots of it. But someone was very aware that this technology existed and wanted to get their hands on it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here deep on the State of the Union. It's the X State of the Union, the UFO file key. We're going to be taking your questions shortly. And Miss Olivia has been very patient tonight. Gracias.
Is there
Senorita?
Before you move on, is there any link to that? And I'm trying to remember her name. Where did the towers go?
Judy Wood.
Hmm.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. One of the very interesting things about Judy is that she said that the weapons that destroyed 9/11 were launched from space. But her work is very interesting. And yeah, I think it's the kind of thing we can definitely follow up.
Yeah.
further
Samuel
on.
Kuntz says, what did Trump see in those docs that he told Napolitano about? Could it be the energy ray that Judy Wood discussed, which she thinks brought down the World Trade Center?
Well, let's go back to the conversation. I've played their conversation, and actually I've heard Napolitano now repeat the story 3 times. And here's how it goes. It's October 26, 2017, and the JFK records are supposed to be released. I'm doing a live stream for Vice, HBO, with Alexandra Bruce from Forbidden Knowledge TV. We're expecting all the records to come out. Judge Napolitano calls the president when he hears that the files aren't coming out. And he said, what's going on, Mr. President? Don't let them talk you out of it. It's by law. You're actually going to be out of compliance with the law if you don't let them out. So don't let the CIA or the FBI convince you otherwise. And Trump says, well, the CIA and the FBI both visited me and they showed me, the reasons it couldn't come out. And then he said, I've seen the whole file. And Napolitano says, well, don't treat the public like children, let it out. And he says, no, you can't. You don't understand. I could never let this out. Like if you were here, you wouldn't be able to let it out. And Napolitano goes on a little further. And finally, Trump just says, Andrew, trust me, there's no way I can let this out. Basically, it would destroy everything. So that's the major impact that it had on Trump inside the JFK assassination files. Now, as I've said before, people have pointed to the JFK assassination files and say the CIA would never allow something to remain in there. It's my feeling on this, and this is a kind of speculative take, that somehow Bobby Kennedy, when he met with the CIA director immediately after the assassination, put something in those records that couldn't be monkeyed with. And that's the reason that they've sat on them and taken the heat for all these years. Now, when they've let out little bits and pieces here and there have been threads, even in the files as they are, that have opened up stories. But the thing that they have not wanted to do is there's only 2 areas that are nuclear to them, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm using nuclear in the loose sense, in the figurative sense. And the 2 areas are the George Joannides files, who we just discussed, who got the Lifetime Achievement Medal from Bobby Inman for something for the CIA. And he's the one that Jefferson Morley discovered was deeply involved in setting up Oswald. And he was major CIA. He was the top psychological operations man, and he was operating in New Orleans, in Florida, in 1963 when the assassination took place. And then the other files are the Jim Garrison files, because the Jim Garrison files also lean into what? They lean into the Defense Industrial Security Command, DISC. And he kept encountering those people, and he could not figure it out. Like, why is Oswald saying he's going to NASA when he's leaving New Orleans? Why are all Oswald's colleagues at Riley Coffee Company going to work either for NASA or for Lockheed or for Boeing? Like, what's going on here? Where are all these people? What is this aerospace mafia that is involved here? All these people getting absorbed into this aerospace machine who are involved with Oswald, showing that Oswald, his involvement in working with Guy Bannister means he was an agent working inside the government, and that they had used him in that corridor between the Defense Industrial Security Command and the aerospace companies. That's what you get to when you get with the Garrison files. So they don't want to let those things out. Those are the two areas that they can't let out. But if Trump was aware of them, obviously he'd seen the records, and he's got guys like Roger Stone, for example. And Roger Stone maybe has lived, the majority of his life as kind of a political hatchet man, but he would know the value of these things. And if Trump is going into, these different situations where they're trying to get him for Russian collusion or impeachment or all these things, and with no basis, then the value of these records going to Mar-a-Lago, I think, would be extraordinarily high, especially if we keep in mind those Posobiec comments, which, if you take or leave Posobiec, it doesn't matter. But just the fact that he was hearing this, that, Trump is saying, I'm taking the JFK records and the UFO files and I'm going to put them all out. Well, now we have Glenn Greenwald, as we started the show off with, saying, yeah, Trump, they were deathly afraid that he was going to do this. And they were doing everything. They wanted the 25th Amendment, even when the election was over and it was, he wasn't going to be president in 2 months. They still wanted to get him out in the meantime. So now let's look and turn our minds to situations like Julian Assange and start to think, wait a minute, what is it that's really going on here? Because these guys are deathly afraid of the information that Assange was bringing forward, of the information. Remember, Assange helped Trump tremendously in the 2016 election. He was the reason that Trump won, in my opinion, because he was releasing on a weekly basis the Hillary emails. And that was devastating for the Hillary campaign. So when we start to put these pieces together, here's what we're looking at. The UFO file is the ultimate chip in the poker game that's going on between these world players. And when it comes to a deep state level, there's nobody dirtier than the deep state, and their main agents are the face of the deep state is the Central Intelligence Agency. And yes.
Well, there's a question, Jim, that I was going to ask. Jimmy Kennemer, my girl wants to know how the CIA relates to the deep state.
Well, there are major, and look, this goes directly from the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott. And that's where my entire definition of the deep state comes from. He was the one who invented the term, and he used, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK as the first version of the deep state look. And that book is from 1993. So Professor Scott, who, is a professor at UC Berkeley on the left coast, and he's coming from the left side of the fence, but he understands how the CIA and the deep state works. And he also understands that the CIA was desperate to get Trump out. But what he says is that here's the way to think of the deep state. You have these groups that are representative inside the deep state. One of the groups that is like the mainstay of the deep state is the Central Intelligence Agency. And who do they use? Organized crime. So those two pieces you see right around the JFK assassination. The third piece are the contracting agencies that the Central Intelligence Agency employs to keep its own activities secret. Booz Allen Hamilton. Well, who came out of that? Edward Snowden. So, and then the groups that deal with very high finance, because remember, the CIA is founded out of high finance. It's a New York law firm, S&C, that gets the whole thing rolling. And Alan Dulles is a lawyer, drawing up the charter of the CIA, on the S&C letterhead. I mean, this is the nature of who they are. So those foreign international finance interests are going to be represented by our activities. Here's an example. So, and this is one of Professor Scott's examples. So somewhere in Central Asia, we get it in our heads, an oil company decides, aha, I am going to develop a whole oil extraction operation there. But the government itself is so unstable that my whole operation can really be completely, taken over if a revolutionary gets in there, and I'll be finished. So they go to the CIA and say, can you create like a scenario where we get rid of that leader and put in an American friendly guy so that, we have a situation where our oil fields are going to be protected. So it's up to them to figure out, for this American business interest, I need to do this. So they'll drum up a whole situation. Now, it's the same situation in Ukraine when the CIA went in there and performed a coup. And, we've had those before, all the way back to 1953 in Iran, of course. We did the coup there, and President Obama actually apologized for that on behalf of America. Now, think about it this way. And then proceeded to, bomb the hell out of Libya. So Obama was really about putting a nice front on things, but he did all the same activities that Bush did. Yes.
Mount Cleverest, DJ, to whom or to what does the CIA answer to? Forgive the metaphor, but what is on top of that pyramid?
See, this is the nature of the thing. It is the levels of extreme power. And what we need to understand about X-Protect, the group that operates between the intelligence corridor and the defense contractors, that group, I think if we can penetrate down to who they are and who their operators are, you're getting a tremendous power base, because you're talking about advanced technology and you're talking about a knowledge of something which is completely hidden from the average person. So when you get into that knowledge base, it affects medicine, it affects science, it affects economic concerns. So, we can speculate about who the central controlling power is. But when you say the deep state, you start to understand that that's an entire system that's running parallel with our system. And you can think about it this way, that when it needs a policy shift, when it needs things to change, when it needs to introduce draconian measures, when it wants emergency powers, it steps into the public realm, creates a deep event like 9/11, and then steps back out. And then it creates consolidation, but nobody can put their finger on who did that. Instead, we're stuck with the designated culprits, Lee Harvey Oswald, the 19 hijackers, or whoever. It's a small group. Everyone that I talk to who's in the know about these things says that it's not a large group that's doing this. And so now, the biggest coup, I think, that they're on the cusp of is a UFO threat opportunity, and using that UFO threat. Look how they just used the entire, what I call the pharmaceutical emergency. They generated a lot with that. And now we have the guy on the UFO side that is the heir apparent to Elizondo, Dr. Gary Nolan. And what is he doing? He's shouting out to Dr. Fauci. It's like passing the baton from one threat op, the pharma threat op, to the UFO threat op. So it's the same people. And again, it does seem like a pretty small group, doesn't it? That's really, and it's a bad sign. I mean, if he wants to be all into Dr. Fauci and all that, that's up to him. But it's a bad sign for transparency in the UFO field, especially if it's going to be a mockery, because he says he's also a contactee. And so if it's going to be a mockery of all these people who've put forward real experiences, and here's this guy who's a CIA immunologist, and he's going to give you a come to Jesus moment on the UFO file. Sorry. It's very simple. I think with the UFO file, no CIA. That's it. So what you'll have then, the thing will split, and you'll have people doing the UFO file research. And there's a great basis for that. Stan Friedman, John Mack. I mean, there's an incredible background. And then you'll have this weird CIA circus over here, and whoever they can pull into their orbit. and they've got the money in the swing, I'd say, to do it. And we've seen them do quite a bit of it. Now let's look at some wild cards here. I had the Sherlock Holmes thing. Oh boy. Miss Olivia, why don't you give me a question while I'm going for the wild card?
Okay. Alchemical weddings. Why is the CIA trying to control disclosure? What are they covering up in that process?
It's a real good question. The way that I look at what the CIA does is they co-opt things that allow them to keep the facts from other groups who they don't serve, and allow them to maintain, for those they do serve, the kind of central power axis that they've developed over the past 75 years. Now, on the UFO thing, you know, in 2017, UFOs were the top search. And this is before the TTSA or any of that stuff. But and I mean, TTSA did come out in 2017, in fact, but the survey itself, the largest Google search, was related directly to this UFO thing. And I think what they said to themselves was, we need to put all our chips behind this operation. And what we can do is we can use people's own interests about it against them, because, you know, hey, you want aliens? Good. We'll give you a UFO threat. We'll develop offices inside the government. There'll be a gigantic boondoggle, and we'll create an entire infrastructure for that level of control. But most importantly, especially with the political failures of so many of the leaders that we see, they've had a real hard time on the leadership front. Biden operating on 30% approval, Justin Trudeau 28%, barely in Canada, barely hanging on. So this idea that they could create, and that they had in place to create, a fundamental emergency powers reason, and the UFOs could be their ultimate UFO get out of jail card for all these leaders, because I don't think that the leaders have the ability with those types of numbers to maintain and govern. And so therefore they're going to need emergency powers to govern. So we saw Trudeau, for example, in Canada, come out with Freeland, and they both pressed the emergency button when the truckers came. And they were like, we're going to run you by emergency powers. And they didn't back down language-wise. They didn't look for reconciliation. What they were looking for was a fight, interestingly enough. So that whole system, I think that the World Economic Forum, the Central Intelligence Agency, these systems intertwine. And again, we're looking at a small group of interests operating and keeping control of 8 billion people. And so in relation to the UFO file, the threat is a big piece. And I think the threat controls power, influence, money, and ultimately political sway. Yes.
Danielle Jorgensen, the mechanism of psycho-spiritual control is the same, but they need a new origin story for the new, quote, orthodoxy.
Well, see, Gigi Young gets into the origin story, and she nails it, which is the idea of them creating, like, oh, we found these ruins on Mars. Actually, our progenitors were from Mars. And, they start to create this, in this AI cyborg type thing, like, we, the enlightened scientists, have this background on Mars, and we're not down there with the rabble of humanity. I think you can see a lot of things like that, because I think their biggest problem, and they've tried to even remove this, we've seen this, the longing for spirituality in humanity. Rudolf Steiner predicted this, that they would come up with something that would actually strip it out of the human reason to want to express spirituality, because they want to put themselves in that place of God. And that's the ultimate, I think, when you look at this situation, because they want to play God. And we see it from their cloning experiments. We see it from their scientific dictatorship, the development of AI, the way that it's going, the singularity, like, put my head on a cyborg and I'll live forever, and that whole thing. So it's a sick environment to start with. And the problem is the technology has given them the lead edge so that it's easier to manipulate the populace. If anything, they needed to be checked, back in the 60s and 70s when there was still some public outrage about these things. Then the technology came in, the soma for the populace, and now they're kind of dropping the mask and they don't need to say anymore, hey, we want you and your family to have a thriving life and a great middle class and all the rest of it. Instead, they're like, well, get used to not having the things that you used to have. And this is the nature, I think, of what the game that they're playing. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind so much the Earth being a playground for playing God, except that there are beings here who want to play God and rule over others, right?
Yes.
And that's, if you just want to edge God out, right? And, pretend there is no God and just, see how far you can get without God, right? That seems to be part of the game here, in denial of God. That's, all fine and well. I think that's part of what's happening here, but it's other people lording over others, keeping truth from them, brainwashing them, mind controlling them, and poisoning and genociding them.
Oh, it's so unethical. And this is the thing. I mean, they have the same thing. Think about the CIA agent who is lying to the public in the 50s and 60s about a number of things, and he can say to himself, I'm doing it because I love America and I know that the communists are a threat. So anything that I do to, propaganda to keep America safe, then it's okay because I'm the one who's guiding it. And I'm doing it for this higher purpose, this higher ethical reason. This is the nature of the thing. And, when you see like Bono holding hands with Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, something weird is going on in there. They're like a cult, and it's like, hey, we're saving humanity, and you remember the 2012 movie, I mentioned it when we did the Pole Shift episode, but at the end of it, they're like, oh, we went through all those bad things and we landed in South Africa and we'll start a new Eden because we're the good people and all the bad people got swallowed up. So, this is part of the thing, the story, I think, that they're feeding out to themselves. But I think it's obvious that these groups have, like the CIA, like the NSA, the last time we had any real check on this stuff was 40 years ago. So, these aren't self-correcting institutions. Look at all the torture investigations, right? What did we end up with? I mean, basically, Bloody Gina, who ran the torture organizations for the CIA, became the CIA director. So, and that was under Trump. So, there's a nature, there's no accountability. And this is a big problem with it. So one of the things about the Central Intelligence Agency, the question comes up, can you even reform it anymore? Do they even have the ability to reform it? Because in their own minds, they can do anything they want. They have their own Air Force. And the idea that they had to remove a president at a certain point because he was a national security threat because he wanted to share the UFO file with Russia. Well, there was the line of duty for them. But, they're making themselves God. They made those decisions. And the Central Intelligence Agency moves on to control the media. They move on to control large, vast amount of entertainment. Who is it that gives them the authority to do all these things? It's entirely unconstitutional. And that is an important thing. Any leader who got in there, the first thing he would have to do is rein in this completely out of control agency and then take the 250,000 employees of Homeland Security and saying, what the hell do we even have you for? Since when did the American people agree to 250,000 employees? What are those people doing? You're not even controlling the border. I mean, so we have a major problem in government. And now the next thing they did, they assigned 87,000 IRS agents. And they're going to be armed and they're trained to do house raids. I mean, they're making this into a police state. It does not have to be like this at all. We go back to the leadership, and the people who are supporting these things should be voted out, and the people who don't want that kind of reality should be voted in. That's a pretty simple equation.
Do you want to mention PayPal at all?
There's that whole thing too. Well, let me keep rolling here to see if I can get all this in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Woo, going deep on the X State of the Union. And keeping in mind, we are on the cusp here with the UFO file. We're on the brink. And what they're trying to do now with the sightings over the Ukraine, somehow the whole thing is getting integrated into the war story. Something's going on here. They're utilizing the technology. We're getting nuclear threats. It's the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is in an unstable, unusual place. And in the background is that player around the UFO file. We're going to be taking more of your questions here shortly. I'm going to try to wrap this up. And on a very interesting note, by the way, a couple of things about Popular Mechanics. One, look at the tagline now that Popular Mechanics uses. Are you ready? This is their traditional pitch to get you or I as a subscriber. Popular Mechanics, building plans, UFOs, monster machines, and badass planes right this way. So the number 2 thing they have in Popular Mechanics is UFOs now. Isn't that amazing? Think about it. If that isn't them moving directly into the alternative media field to control the narrative, I don't know what is. But Popular Mechanics now, they are the arbiters of UFO truth, and don't you forget it. I never thought I'd live to see the day. I wanted to mention that it's either yesterday or today. It was John Mack's birthday. There's the Harvard professor who I was lucky enough to meet on multiple occasions, actually. And was a very interesting guy. And I had a friend who worked for him, but he was the Harvard professor who studied UFO abductions, wrote very fascinating books around the subject, like Passport to the Cosmos, and really moved the ball on the whole thing. And I think he would have thought it was an absolute disaster and disgrace with the CIA moving into the field where they did. But it is, and he died, unfortunately, in a car crash in the UK, and he was hit by a car, actually. And but when he was alive and he was coming out and doing this for Harvard, he was given a tremendously hard time. Time magazine had him on the cover, and just like they should take away, his professorship and should get him out of Harvard and all the rest. But now 20 years later, they have Avi Loeb saying like, hey, the CIA is great to have on my board of Galileo. We're going to get to the science truth with all these CIA people who are good at scientific medicine. Something strange about it all when you think about it. But Harvard has been home to a lot of it. But Mack, I will say, really kind of made the grade. One thing I want to point out is, do you remember a little story about the person who was in charge of the space program in Israel coming out and saying, Trump is aware of the alien things and he can't come out and talk about it because it will cause mass panic? Do you remember this unusual story?
Mm-hmm.
Ex-Israeli space boss says aliens live among U.S. and the U.S. have struck a deal with the Galactic Federation. There he is. He's the real deal. There's no Corey Good nonsense going on there. This guy's the real thing. And he says President Donald Trump, this was in 2020, December 2020, President Donald Trump almost revealed that the U.S. is secretly working with aliens from the Galactic Federation on Mars, claimed the former head of Israel's security space program to Israeli media on Monday. According to Professor Haim Eshed, who served as the head of Israel's space program from 1981 to 2010, not only is the American government in contact with aliens, but the aliens advised President Trump not to reveal their existence in case of mass hysteria. The UFOs have asked not to publish that they are here. Humanity is not ready yet. Trump was on the verge of revealing, but the aliens in the Galactic Federation are saying, wait, let people calm down first. They don't want to start mass hysteria. They want to first make us sane and understanding, said Eshed, quoted in the press, Jerusalem Times. Now, let's think of that. Let's just keep an open mind temporarily and go back into the Mar-a-Lago raid. Are you ready? There's a lot of interesting stories out here. NewsClick had them. Why it's time to declassify documents from Trump's basement. Interesting little remarks here. The saga of the Mar-a-Lago raid sheds some light on the important question of who really controls what we're permitted to see about the inner workings of our own government. While the sitting president may, in theory, have unilateral authority to declassify and release information to the American people, the deep state bureaucracy still holds the power to obstruct the president. As one former bureaucrat told CNN, the process for declassification must include sign-off from the agency that classified the information in the first place in order to protect the intelligence gathering process, sources, and methods. We've always heard that. Whatever one thinks of Trump, is it really in the public interest to have a deep state controlling what information gets out to the public? In 1953, the CIA directed a military coup that overthrew democratically elected Iranian leader Mohammad Mossadegh. 1973, the CIA helped overthrow democratically elected Chilean leader Salvador Allende. These leaders were targeted not only because they were unfriendly to the American people, but because they were unfriendly to international oil and copper interests that wanted to exploit those countries' resources. Many scholars believe the CIA was complicit in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Yet 60 years later, thousands of key documents remain redacted or under seal. President Trump came to office promising to release those records as required by the JFK Records Act, but deep state bureaucrats opposed to their release, claiming it would cause potentially irreversible harm to our national security, made Trump back down, quite possibly recalling the fate of the last president to go to war with the CIA. President Kennedy had faced off against the Central Intelligence Agency and had fired their leader for wanting to cause a war in Cuba, Allen Dulles. And so he was in a battle, and he was diametrically opposed to the CIA and tried to figure out a way. He couldn't believe when he got into power the level to which the Central Intelligence Agency controlled what the United States did. And so one of the things that he did was, he had a couple of meetings with Khrushchev, and he went and had a summit with Khrushchev in Berlin, and they had an incredible encounter where at first Khrushchev belittled him and said, why should we listen to you? You had a pampered existence. I grew up as a working class guy, and we have missiles and we'll use them against you. If you want to berate us as a second-rate power, we'll teach you a lesson. And it was a completely unprofessional and ridiculous meeting. And Kennedy's impression was, we're going to go to nuclear war with this guy. He's insane, and he won't back down, and he's acting like a bully. And they left that first summit on very shaky terms, and what they got was the Berlin Wall instead of a war. And that was through Kennedy's leadership. But he said, a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Later, what happened was the hardcore side of the Russian Defense Department really got on Khrushchev's ear and said, look, Americans have missiles all over the place. Why don't we put missiles in Cuba? And there's a lot of, kind of hot zone reasons behind this placement of missiles in Cuba that, I want to bring into the picture, and I bring it in through the Hot Zone series. But for the sake of the face of the traditional story, they wanted to put missiles in Cuba to offset our missiles. And that Kennedy, in sussing this out with them, the way that they had done it invited our military to respond militarily, and Cuba would have shut off nuclear weapons against us on behalf of the Soviets. And Kennedy went on television and said, if anybody fires anything, it's going to come back on the Soviet Union because they put the missiles there. But he went behind the scenes and he told Khrushchev that it would be in his own best interest to withdraw the missiles. And he knew that Khrushchev needed a bone to get control of his own house again. And he talked to him about it and said, look, you've got factions there inside your own military who don't realize that some of the missiles that they're complaining about, like our Jupiter missiles in Turkey, don't even work. And they're due to be decommissioned. So you're not even going to be dealing with those missiles. So, make that extra motion, and you've got a blockade around Cuba now. And, we don't have to go to nuclear war. Just take the missiles out and return the situation to the strategic normal. And Khrushchev, in their meetings and in their letter exchanges, had a quality, which is he would send one thing and say, maybe we could come to terms based on what you said. And then the next thing would be, we're coming in, and we have missiles and you can't do anything to us. We'll bury you and all the rest of it. And so Kennedy decided that the way to handle him was to approach him, his good side, and to respond to him when he sent correspondence that was reasonable, and to ignore the unreasonable bullying letters. And what happened as a result, kind of diplomacy, which over 13 days took the world to the brink of nuclear war, and Kennedy had them back off. They actually, in an extraordinary defeat for the Russians, but a victory for the world, he took the missiles that would have caused World War III out of Cuba and brought them back to the Soviet, like packed them up and brought them back. And what's interesting is he developed an incredible respect for Kennedy and how he developed in that situation. And they decided, we're going to work together to do the moon landing, and we're going to work together on these different things. That's the kind of leadership that's required in America right now. And this ridiculous, keep pushing everything to the brink and having this guy with Alzheimer's, wobble up to the camera and talk about Armageddon, it just isn't it. They need to fire Anthony Blinken, get him out of there immediately, put in a capable Secretary of State, get rid of Austin. He's a terrible defense secretary, and put in somebody who's capable, goes there and develops an actual peace process to bring into these people. And you need to get, the little weird comedian guy that they have running Ukraine and say, look, stop making provocative comments about us taking out Russian nuclear sites and just shut your mouth. And, we just gave you $100 billion. Just, zip it already. And, they need to get control of that situation, have a real peace process going on, because what they're doing is so incredibly dangerous. And to think of where we've devolved over the course of that 60 years, having faced a nuclear situation through the leadership of President Kennedy, and how he diffused an incredibly, what looked like inevitable. Even the newspapers at the time were like, we're going to have a nuclear exchange. Now in our newspapers, they're delighting in it. They're like, well, a nuclear exchange, it might be okay. We might be able to get through. It might just be part of the thing we have to deal with, So these people they're sort of lost any sense of reality. And what does Biden do? His big movement is not start a new peace process or get, different countries around the world to join in a peace process. No, what does he do? He orders $290 million worth of radioactive pills to stockpile for Americans in case, we get in a nuclear shooting war with Russia over Ukraine, okay, which is a country 5,000 miles away, which we don't have a great deal of interest in. Now, I think that the people on the Ukraine side, I don't think that the Russians should go in there. And, but they have a long history going on. And I think our support for Ukraine should be an international effort, and that we shouldn't try to put NATO on the doorstep of Russia. So, these things really bring it all home. And when you look at what we're dealing with, that's on the surface. They're trying to get us as a new normal to deal with the idea of a nuclear exchange. It is absolute insanity, the way that they're pursuing this. Now, I've put forward the idea that the UFO file is a key in how all this is being approached, and it's the unseen key. So therefore, we can't actually get a handle on the threats that are going on back and forth. But the truth is, if we're in an actual war with Russia, which even people like Kissinger say we should never get to, think about it. The ultimate war maniac is like, these guys are even crazier than I ever was. And he, at 99 years old, is saying, you don't want a war with Russia. What are you guys doing? Then I think we need to put the brakes on. There should be maybe a national walkout day in America, just saying, we don't want war with Ukraine and Russia. We don't want to support that. Where's the peace process? Like, get things back to a strategic normal. And we don't accept any kind of normalcy of a nuclear exchange. This is total insanity. And we don't want radioactive pills, and Stepford Biden can keep all that stuff in the basement of the White House. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist State of the Union. By the way, that is President Kennedy walking out of church after Khrushchev said over Radio Moscow that we're taking the missiles out. And it is Kennedy's triumph that he didn't try to bully Khrushchev. He tried to work to his good side, and he responded to those positive things and tried to develop a real relationship, respecting them as another superpower. A couple of quick things on that Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy and wrote a letter to Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, pledging that the United States would not invade Cuba if Khrushchev removed recently installed nuclear missiles from the communist-controlled island. On the following day, Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that he had agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In return, the U.S. Armed Forces had gone on high alert. The Strategic Air Command went to stage 4 alert, one step away from launching an all-out nuclear attack previously. So the exchange diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis, which for 2 weeks threatened to precipitate a nuclear holocaust between the two superpowers. That's when they put the U.S. Armed Forces on command. 3 days earlier, the White House had waited to see whether Soviet ships bound for Cuba carrying additional missiles would try to break the U.S. naval blockade in active war around the island. And this is another thing. When they found out that there were missiles there, everyone in the deep state side, like, the Dulles types, were all like, go in there and bomb the missile sites. But Kennedy's idea was, if there are missiles already operational there, you'll set off a nuclear war. And what he did instead, which is brilliant, is he put a barricade around incoming, so you couldn't bring any more missiles in and no more threatening weapons. So by creating a blockade, he basically gave them time to work out the situation instead of going in and just blowing everything up. And this is the type of leadership that we see going forward that we really needed. And just to wrap that up, on October 26th, Khrushchev responded to the naval blockade. Kennedy called it a quarantine. Quarantine is different because a blockade is an actual war term, and a quarantine can be for a variety of reasons. So Khrushchev sent a long letter to Kennedy offering him a deal. Soviet ships bound for Cuba would not carry any kind of armaments if the United States vowed never to invade Cuba. Let us show good sense, Khrushchev said. Weigh well what the aggressive pirate actions which you have declared the U.S. intends to carry out in international waters would lead to. And he went on this thing saying, like, do you really want a war, Kennedy? And like, if you stop me, you're going to get war. Is that really what you want? Think about it, bang. And there's a lot of blackmail language from Khrushchev. But again, Kennedy's response is fascinating. He followed this approach on the following day, Khrushchev, by offering to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States would remove nuclear missiles from Turkey. This is an interesting thing because, again, the Jupiter missiles were going to be decommissioned anyway. And Kennedy had already offered, look, those things are going up, they're going to be decommissioned. You can't threaten us with them. We're going to take them down ourselves. Like, let's just do this. And Kennedy and his inner circle of advisors, including his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, the U.S. Attorney General, pondered how to respond. Robert Kennedy suggested they take up Khrushchev's first offer and ignore the second letter. The second letter had all this bellicose language in it, and it was this nature of the two sides of Khrushchev that Kennedy had to learn how to deal with. So by responding to the first letter that was like, well, maybe we both should get together and do this, Kennedy responded to that and ignored the second letter, which had all the bellicose statements. While the United States has been considering the removal of the missiles from Turkey for some time, agreeing to the Soviet demand for their removal might give the appearance of weakness. Nevertheless, behind the scenes, Russian diplomats were informed that the missiles in Turkey would be removed after the Soviet missiles in Cuba were taken away. An explicit threat accompanied this information. If the Cuban missiles were not removed in 2 days, the United States would resort to military action. It was now Khrushchev's turn to consider an offer and end the standoff, which he did. So Kennedy was able to maintain a very strong pose and also convinced Khrushchev on this line. Interestingly enough, the idea that they were going to go into space together and not have this space race would have defeated the whole Cold War tension idea and creates this real sense that the military-industrial complex had a lot to lose by leaving Kennedy in there. And what's fascinating is not only was Kennedy assassinated while working out this whole thing about a new space policy with Khrushchev and the Russians, but Khrushchev himself would get thrown out in a coup just a few months after Kennedy was assassinated. Interestingly enough, Khrushchev, when Kennedy was assassinated, publicly went up to the book, of remembrance, and he signs it in public, his own condolences to the person that he negotiated the nuclear peace with. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary when you think about it. And now we know, as I said, from his son Sergei, that this all came about as a result of what? Behind the scenes, they started to talk outside of the State Department around these different channels. There'd be a media guy who would go to Berlin and he'd be carrying a newspaper, and inside that he'd leave the newspaper in a cafe, and this other guy who was a newspaper guy for the Russians would come in and take the newspaper up, and that would be a message directly from Kennedy to Khrushchev. They had all these different interesting channels. So they got around the warmongers in the State Department, the CIA, and in the military. And by doing that, they developed also a hotline back and forth so that at a moment's notice, they could pick up the phone and get on the phone with each other. All those things came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if we contrast that with the kind of bozo show that we have today, if we could get a capable foreign policy team in there, it would make all the difference. And the piece around the UFO file gives us the answer on this also, because if they were going to go into space together, they were going to share, as that memo showed, Kennedy was going to share with Khrushchev these deep UFO cases so that they would be on par with each other. This gets us to Watergate lawyer Caddy's story about E. Howard Hunt telling him Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to share the UFO file with the Russians. That is the piece of history that's missing in the record books. And this is the thing that I think explains so much of it. That's what we need to bring forward. And because remember, you're dealing with both sides. You're dealing with nukes and you're dealing with the UFO file around these tensions. That's how we can get some openness going. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the X State of the Union. My last bit here has to do with Elon Musk and also Nixon. And then we're going to take your questions. We're going to go a little late tonight, which is good. But Miss Olivia, how are you?
I already have some questions about Elon.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Take them.
All right, Jordan Banner. So how do Elon's satellites play into the big picture with these guys? And Ted Gunderson says Starlink sure seems exactly the same as Skynet.
Well, now at this point with Musk, we're at a point where, because of all the power concentrated there for him as a corporate entity, as the richest man in the world and all the rest, you're no longer dealing with a person per se. So he's a person, but all the things in his responses have to do with group interests. And so he represents a whole faction, and that's the whole space president, space development piece. And what they want to do, and it's really an old Nazi goal, in fact, is they want to rule everything on the ground from space. And the satellite capability, the weaponry in space, the pinpointing everyone's movement on the planet, the level of surveillance, it gives them that ability to do it. Now, you can just be an entrepreneur and go into space and develop all these things that they're going to do, like space mining and, space travel, tourism, and all the rest of it. But let's face it, these people haven't been trustworthy on traditional levels. Look what they just did with the lockdowns and everything else. So they're not trustworthy in a traditional sense. And so we have to look at the whole thing through that lens when we're looking at someone like Musk. Now, it's possible that Musk, even under those circumstances, steps out of line once in a while. And you'll see that, he gets the whip, right? And in the latest case, when he suggested there should be a peace in Ukraine by having Russia assume those 4 small areas that show overwhelmingly that they want to be part of Russia, not part of Ukraine, then he got incredible grief, but it was from the Chinese media and the Ukraine Foreign Ministry. And they were really getting into some antics on Twitter and things that just were absolutely idiotic. And like, where's the diplomacy with these countries and these people? I mean, it's absolutely shocking. So we're in a weird we're in a weird place with that. But I would say, yeah, you're looking at more than that when it comes to Musk. Remember X steganography and how it relates to X technology, which is the UFO file technology. It's the Tesla technology. It's that level which is not exposed to the public, the banned level, banned from public consumption. The New York Times runs an article right after Musk's strange comments about X, where he says the X accelerant is on and that I'm going to create X, which will be the app for everything. And so Twitter, the purchase of Twitter is an accelerant for that. So this thing about X, the X steganography works. It's a signal. It says, I have the X technology. That's the way to look at it. So New York Times, what does X mean to Elon Musk? So basically, think about X steganography. As I said, it's basically out of the closet at this point. Let's find out what the New York Times is willing to surmise about this. And remember, we know the New York Times and where they're coming from. And let's just say the idea of them giving us any honest answers about things is pretty remote. But let me read this anyway. Quote, New York Times now. The letter X has had significance in the billionaire's life from his early days as an entrepreneur to his personal life and now to his pursuit of Twitter. Elon Musk proposed on Monday to acquire Twitter, $54 a share. This is October 6th, the article. What is X? Mr. Musk, the richest man in the world and the chief executive of the auto company Tesla, putting it all together, has been thin on details about what an everything app would look like. But he's expressed interest in making a worldwide social media platform modeled after WeChat, which is owned by Chinese technology giant Tencent. In China, WeChat is used by more than 1 billion people as an all-in-one social media, instant messaging, and mobile payment app used to order food, hail cabs, and news. Now he wants to make X do this. Quote, said Musk, I think such an app would be really useful, and just the utility of sport, of a spam-free thing where you can make comments, post videos, and I think it's important for content creators to have a revenue share. All right, that's making it sound like anything. This is the guy who's taking over the auto industry, the space industry, and he's like, oh yeah, I want to make an app where you can post videos, right? Obviously, he's getting at something totally different. In August, when a Twitter user asked Musk whether he had considered creating his own social platform, he replied, X.com. Earlier that month, at Tesla's annual shareholder meeting, Mr. Musk said he had a pretty grand vision for X as something that would be very useful to the world. Mr. Musk has not publicly offered a plan or a timeline for X, but he has said that despite not being necessary to create X, Twitter probably would accelerate X by 3 to 5 years. Should Mr. Musk acquire Twitter, it is unclear if he would make X from scratch using parts of Twitter or turn Twitter into X. And so on they go, referring to X and not really telling us what it is. We have some idea that it's an app, and then it'll handle everything. So fundamentally, I've put forward that X steganography is something that they used to move the advanced technology through government agencies. So a program that would be a black project would suddenly surface and something like the X-15 would come out of it. And this is how they're signaling to different people inside of that establishment that they have the advanced technology and they're plugging it in to it. The advanced technology could come from the developments that we have through somebody like Nikola Tesla, where they take the name directly. So now with Musk, actually, you have Tesla and you have X. I mean, that's getting pretty close to, everything that's located there inside the UFO file. So basically, the way that I read it is fundamental. The X technology and the X steganography, the thing that they were trying to bring forward, and they realized by signaling it to each other, Bezos has used the X steganography as well, that as they've signaled that over the years through these different projects and programs, they're at a point where they're ready to just say, this X thing is on, we're ready, and you basically become part of this project X. And remember that X comes directly now, directly out of this system of Guy Bannister developing the X-Files for the FBI. It's the same thread using the same terminology. And when we trace that steganography further back, it goes right back into those mystery schools. So, you can find X steganography as far back as the Book of the Dead or as recent as this New York Times article. This is a key piece for us to understand. It's like a puzzle piece that opens up more. So when we understand that they've been using the technology and that they're going to unleash the technology that they've developed, the thing that they've developed is in relationship to the UFO file. There's no question. So that piece that they've signaled to each other and faced off with each other, and Trump, through John Trump and his background there, has also indicated, I have control over this Space Force. I'm taking the UFO file under the umbrella of Space Force. One of the fascinating things about the Millie Weaver interview last night was that her source was like, hey, that Mar-a-Lago raid? That was related directly to the Space Force. Well, think about it. The Space Force is the most likely place for Trump to have reacquired the UFO file, and therefore they wouldn't want him to have that. And so, interestingly enough, one of the things that I read was that they're not happy with the raid that they did. That in fact, what's going on is that they're looking for ways. They're saying Trump may have more classified documents, and that they floated the idea in the Washington Post that Trump would get raided again. So they're looking for something. And it's incumbent on us, or any kind of good, independent, investigative journalism, to figure out what is it that they're trying to find among Trump's possessions, because it ain't what they're saying it is. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay. GDNPB, Ukraine with Starlink is being led by the first AI commander. I didn't know about this.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Well, here's where they moved Musk into that position of space president. So they announce, Russia is having war activities going into Ukraine. Instantly, Elon is out there and he says to Ukraine, hey, I'll give you Starlink and they won't be able to knock your internet out. And they give him a thumbs up like, thanks, Elon, space president, This is ridiculous. Let's think about it. These are things that should be negotiated by governments. It has nothing to do with corporations. He's putting his corporation in the middle of a highly, disastrous foreign policy situation. And so obviously that's all being handled by the government or whatever, but they wanted to present it and they wanted us to get used to this idea that, oh yeah, forget about, the leaders that you've elected and that are bound by the Constitution and all that. This space president can just come along and dish out Starlink wherever he wants. Starlink is another one of those control factors. And again, you have to always think about the space grid and the idea of controlling what's on the ground from above. Now, of course, we have every kind of use for satellites and, low Earth orbit control of GPS and all the rest of that. I'm not saying that those things aren't incredible benefits. The problem is that the tools are in the wrong hands. And so the properties and the things that these things can do have to be considered from different angles than the utilitarian angle that they would be ordinarily. So the idea is, what can I do with you as a population if I want to control you? Let's suppose that I'm 5,000 people strong and I need to control 8 billion people. Well, I need to be able to see where you are at all times, one. Two, I need to be able to, implement programs from space to be able to control you on the ground. And so, there's a range of things that fall into this. So Starlink is like the face of that. It's basically to make fascism hip. That's the way that I look at it. Yes.
Do you see Elon as kind of globalist light?
Yes. That whole thing, when the conservatives were going crazy about Elon, I'm open to anyone in that command structure coming to their senses and standing up against, other groups. And I don't think that thing is a monolith. I think that people like Dr. Farrell have pointed out, it's not, this is like more like the mafia. We have competing factions who will face off against each other, and ultimately through human nature, human AI nature, we'll blackmail and try to take over each other and, come out on top and all the rest of it. So that's the way I think we need to think about them. They're not a monolith, and they do have fractures. And I think that Musk certainly goes off the reservation at times. And but the problem is, fundamentally, I think that he's been created, and I think that they pass by other guys like Bigelow and, to a lesser extent, Bezos, as far as the space part goes. Bezos has a very like Noah's Ark type moon thing going on with Blue Origins as well, and he's using X-steganography. He's got it, but they're backing Musk. There's no question about that. And I think once in a while, there's this thing about Elon where you get the impression he stepped off the reservation and they're kind of pushing him back. But nevertheless, as far as the leadership goes, at this point, we're looking for signs that there's any sanity going on, or any sanity left among that group.
You know what's interesting? I've been trying to clarify my own vibe on Musk, and everybody has different opinions and the ideas from. But,
yeah.
He does not seem, I think that he's a pragmatist. I think that he knows that the globalists are going to win. They have their agenda. They're very far ahead, and he is aligned with them and a lot of their agendas. But it doesn't seem to me that he has the kind of disdain for humanity that so many of the globalists do have, right? He doesn't share. He's the only one I've heard speak about the concern that of real depopulation, that the numbers, the danger of having the human population drop severely.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. There are some projects that he's associated with that seem very anti-human. So it's hard. It's a hard thing to say, but he may have the ear of a faction that is concerned about looking like, bloodthirsty Frankenstein, and they want to do it in a smoother fashion. Even look back to the Rockefellers and Kissinger wing, and the Bush wing. These people did all kinds of things that were involved with drug running and political control, blackmail, and all the rest of it. But on the surface, they very much wanted to present differently. They didn't want it out in the open. One of the grand things that took place during the Iraq War was that President Bush was chiding in public, former President Bush, G.H.W. Bush, Bush the First. He was chiding in public Cheney and Rumsfeld for the way that they were conducting this, because he knew that W was going to be the one hanging in the balance. And so this happens every once in a while, because, again, when you get into these groups, and when you look at, the think tanks and the things like that, they're looking good, like Lloyd Blankfein saving Patagonia and this kind of thing. This is the image that they want. They don't want people to think of Lloyd Blankfein destroying so many lives during the 2008-2009 bailouts with the incredible destruction of people's mortgages and everything else through Goldman Sachs. He wants to go out and be like, I'm saving, the world. And this is the nature. It's kind of like the Pharisees type thing. They want to be seen among the public as doing good. But there's a group inside there that's a little more psycho, and it's kind of the Facebook, style big tech leadership. They seem to have no regard for how they'll appear. And you get that, I think, in the Chrystia Freeland Trudeau piece, when they were just going nuts and acting crazy in front of the truckers, not negotiating with them and being like, they're misogynists and we shouldn't tolerate these people. Do you remember that? I mean, hello, Hitler, 1938. So there are factions there that don't want to present as, these kind of bloodthirsty leadership fascists. So I think you could be onto something that Musk is one of those. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I'm still on the fence about Musk. I think Beau Krill's kind of nailed it. It's more like a humane version of the sort of globalist eugenics, transhumanist agenda.
Excellent
Mhm.
point. Excellent point.
Which
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a way to stop this agenda, but I would like it to be more humane. Maybe that's the best we can do.
Well, I had a thing that I wanted to remind everyone that Clinton ran on the whole Clinton promises to investigate UFOs. Remember those days? By the way, Hillary's supposed to be back in 2024. So watch out for the 2024 election. I feel like all these forces are coming together, and the idea of what they have with Stepford Biden and this kind of Alzheimer's Spock brain situation going on. I think we're looking at something where that whole system is going to be shaken up, and that the leadership that's going to be taking over is going to be, their main job is going to be reining in this incredibly sick, out of control deep state and corporatist elite state. And right now we're using so many of their platforms and so much of their stuff, and Google is so ahead of us, and they're using quantum computers and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, right now, they need to answer to the 8 billion people that are on the planet. And they're a small group. And ultimately, that's maybe the thing that plays in here, which is they've overplayed their hand dramatically, as we saw through the COVID op. And the development of the UFO threat op is also a dramatic overplay. My problem, and what bothers me, is even very smart people don't see, they think that the idea of them doing the UFO threat would make them look so ridiculous that they wouldn't do it. I guarantee you that they're working on it. And I want the really good minds that we have out there to really understand that, which is why I hope that the idea of connecting the deep state researchers who are very aware of like political assassinations and things of that nature can plug into the UFO file research and just, disregard the kind of wacky elements that exist in there, and the ones who are like playing ball with the CIA and all that stuff. Because I think you can get there can be a shift in the entire understanding around the subjects if you get those deep state researchers on board with this stuff. And, the guy I was talking about tonight, Jefferson Morley, his information, he understands so much about Joanides, and he understands so much about how the CIA hid those files, and how the CIA is accountable. And that, and what's interesting about Morley, who's the former Washington Post reporter, reports on the JFK stuff, is he believes that Trump took the JFK records to Mar-a-Lago. So does Greenwald. That's pretty hardcore. You might expect to hear that on Dark Journalist, but to hear that from kind of, Greenwald stuff, that's pretty fascinating. So it's becoming, they're becoming aware of this, and they have their own inside track on this. Here's the interesting question for guys like that who don't care about the UFO file at all. Really, wouldn't it explain a lot if the reason that those files were grabbed is relating to the Kennedy assassination being a result of the UFO file? Think about that. So, so I feel like if those deep state researchers could make that extra jump, we'd be in a totally different territory, highly enlightened, and on a much more even playing field, let's say. Yes.
Okay, before we move on, Joseph is in the chat.
Excellent.
He said Musk equals kinder, gentler Gestapo. And these people are nuts, and power mad, and will do anything.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Three
right.
nuts.
Yeah, if you, right, kinder, gentler. Remember, George H.W. Bush, like, I want a kinder, gentler country, as he was, kind of giving arms to the Iranians to bomb the Iraqis while giving the Iraqis chemical weapons to go after the Iranians. So that's kinder, gentler. Yes.
Okay, let's talk about Trump. So Bo Krills wants to know, is it possible that they just flat out threatened Trump's family or himself? What do you think?
No question. No question. Trump is very complex. Here are the bullet points for you. John Trump. John Trump, Trump's uncle, is Vannevar Bush's protege. Vannevar Bush ran the UFO file. That's the most secret and most highly compartmentalized project that the United States government had in the 40s and 50s. And I'm sure now the secrecy is way off the charts. So John G. Trump also is the person who dealt with the Tesla files, as we've put forward in a number of different programs. So Trump is a lot different than just a loudmouth real estate developer coming into the political scene and getting lucky. He is the card player from the deep state inside the deep state poker game, and they want to get that guy out of there because he's cleaning up. So they'll do anything to get rid of this guy. Now, they did anything to get rid of him while he was president. And, you know, on a number of different, from a number of different angles, he did very well as president. So, you know, their ideas of, you know, this glory of putting him in prison for Russian collusion or whatever goes to a much deeper thing than just political back and forth. We've seen the Bushes and the Clintons fight or whatever. They do dirty techniques, but at the end of the day, they go home to the same master. They're playing for the same team. Trump isn't, but I'm not, you know, Trump's not a saint and he's not a savior, but he's an outsider to those people. And my guess is because of the UFO file piece. That's part of it. There's an article that came out, and this is interesting in relation to Mar-a-Lago, because the Mar-a-Lago bit is, oh, he's in hot water, you know, like he's got these classified documents or whatever. This is the new article. Trump may have more classified docs. New York Times. So they're saying there's another raid on the way. They're looking for something. This is the important key piece. Here's just a little bit of this. The U.S. Justice Department could be planning more searches or subpoenas. You know, searches, code, raid. So they could be looking for another FBI raid of maybe Trump's place in New Jersey. The U.S. Justice Department believes that former President Donald Trump is still holding White House documents, the New York Times reported on Thursday, 2 days ago. According to the newspaper, the department is weighing plans to retrieve the supposed file. So they're threatening outright, we're going for round two with a raid. A president, a sitting ex-president, you know, go through the records. There's never been a president who was raided for anything, not even Nixon when he was facing a Senate trial for Watergate crimes. He never got raided. It's ridiculous. So that is weaponizing the Justice Department. That is a complete departure from any kind of constitutional republic, any kind of constitutional activity at all. That's going after your political opponent because he has something you want. A little more. The newspaper alleged that a top Justice Department official reached out to Trump's legal team in recent weeks, informing them that the officials believe Trump has not returned all the documents he took from the White House at the end of his term. It is unclear what evidence the department has to back up their suspicions. Trump's lawyers then argued over how to proceed, with some arguing in favor of allowing a third party to search Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate for more files and others arguing in favor of resisting. According to the New York Times, the latter group won out. Now, their sources and what they say about what Trump is doing, I don't believe at all. We have no idea what Trump is doing. And the New York Times saying, we had an inside source tell us that Trump is resisting this, you know, don't buy it for a minute. But I think when we look at this, we have to say, whatever it is, they didn't get it because they wouldn't be trying round two if they got it in round one. So that much, I think we can sort of bring to the bank. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist special. This is our State of the Union. It's great to have so many great questions from the ideas room. It's a great crowd out there, fantastic people and familiar faces. It's good to see you. We're going to take a couple more questions on this from you, and then we'll call it a night. Miss Olivia.
Samuel Kuntz, GJ, do you think that Trump would copy those files that the FBI tried to get before they raided? He probably still has them. And Wendy Eater, getting documents seized in a search can be a tricky way to get them admitted as evidence. Any thoughts?
Well, let's think about this for a minute. Since we know that, Clinton and Bush and Nixon and Reagan, all those people took files with them that the National Archives wanted. I'm going to inform you of a couple of weird things. One is that when I was working with the whistleblower Robert Merritt around the Nixon time capsule piece, the person that we sent the letter to at the National Archives is the same person who alleged that Trump had stolen documents. Now, I find that interesting, and I also find his anti-pose rather interesting as well, because he's anti-Trump all the way. But he's just a National Archives guy. It's a pretty, it's like basically being a high-end librarian. It's not usually a heavily politicized position. It's quite strange, in my opinion. So when I look at this situation, I literally think to myself, what is it that Trump could have that they could want so badly? And there's only really three things, in my opinion. I don't think that they would raid him because they thought, hey, you have some document that might tip, North Korea off or something like that. I don't see any of that. And I don't see Trump playing in that game. What I see Trump having is information relating to the UFO file and its relation to why he developed Space Force. 1, 2, the Kennedy assassination files, because it's the ultimate bargaining and poker chip when you're dealing with the deep state, because it exposes the level of their own criminality. And 3, his own knowledge through his uncle around the UFO file and the Tesla file. If they knew that he had that and they wanted it, they would create all these different reasons and go through this whole processing. We're after classified information. But what if they wanted whatever it is his uncle gave him in relation to the UFO file? This could be the reason why they've been such loose cannons to start with. It's very possible. As a matter of fact, it explains a whole range of activity, from Russia collusion to the phony impeachment over the Ukraine call. All these different things start to make a lot more sense. Nancy Pelosi ripping up the script, during the State of the Union. These are things that didn't happen previously in politics. You always maintain a certain decorum. Even when you hated each other, you came out on the debate stage and shook hands and all that kind of stuff. This stuff says, I'm one faction. I'm almost alien to your faction. I don't share things in common, so we don't meet on common ground. So therefore, you are a threat to the entire thing that I'm on top of. I'm going to do everything I can to take you out. That's the reaction that they have to Trump. That speaks to a knowledge level that exists and resides that could threaten the very foundation of the deep state piece. And that includes the NASA part. And if you open up and blow up the Kennedy assassination files, do you get the NASA part? And is that where the UFO file piece resides? And one of the things I'm fond of bringing up in relation to why they always try to keep Trump and Putin apart, and they made it very difficult for them to meet without a translator and all the rest. And Farrell told me that Putin speaks English. That's very important. But what I see in relation to that is, the Russians have a great deal of knowledge about our own UFO program and the things that reside as deep events from our deep state, like the Kennedy assassination, for example, and 9/11. And shall we go through that thread? So there's a lot of posturing on both sides in relation to that. It's a much more, to me, it's a much more logical conclusion that Trump was operating more independently than any other president since Kennedy, and that this is the nature of the problem, and that the reason that he had that track was because he was plugged in to a level of knowledge that made him equal with the deep state. And that would explain a lot, in my opinion. Yes.
Okay, let's switch gears for a minute.
Yes.
And talk about Havana syndrome. Anne-Marie, what about all the research of the Havana syndrome? There seems to be a link between this research and the UFO phenomenon because Gary Nolan has been researching this too.
Yeah, you're going to find Nolan. They're going to be pasting Nolan on the face of all these other things just to get him out there. So when you see like Gary Nolan around Havana syndrome, they're trying to make a name for Nolan so that he's trusted as the UFO authority, and then he could say, I'm also a contactee. So whatever it is that they're cooking up with the weird CIA plan around the UFO threat, Nolan is their go-to person. But the real piece around the Havana syndrome, first of all, when you get into Havana, what are you dealing with? You're dealing with the hot zone. That has to be, in my opinion, the first consideration about the weirdness that's going on there. And so when we get into that, we think to ourselves, at the end of the Obama administration, they finally decide, with not a lot of fanfare, actually, that we're going to open our embassy and restore relations with Cuba for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and for the first time, actually, since the Castro Revolution. So that's many, many years. And they did it, and they established an embassy, and then we get all these State Department workers and CIA agents down there, and they develop Havana syndrome. Here's the weird piece of Havana syndrome, which includes all these headaches. It includes concussions, sound concussions, and a variety of different symptoms that are experienced. Here's the weirdness. When they come back from Cuba, when the State Department's like, let's take all the CIA people and bring them back. When they get back here and they're in DC and they go to their apartment or whatever, they experience the same symptoms. So whatever it is follows them around. And it's not very well explained, but it goes into, the different microwave weapons, acoustic technology, and that piece. But it's obviously a strange one, which, goes beyond what we know about those traditional weapons and the targeting type weapons. So whoever is doing it also seems to be related to a third party, because it doesn't seem to be either Russia or the United States that's doing it. It seems to be somebody who's preventing that reconciliation style of rapprochement to happen. And we've seen that before. I think we're seeing that in Ukraine as well. So it is very fascinating. And I think that you're going to get a lot of answers by thinking of who's the other player involved. That might start to open up some questions. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, is there a faction that wants to expose elite control and one that wants to remain in the shadows? Are these linked to left and right-hand schools or X-Protect, etc.?
Yeah, what was the first part of that again?
Is there a faction that wants to expose elite control and one that wants to remain in the shadows?
Yes. So I think when you look at the UFO file, think of it this way. Okay, one group has controlled it for a long period of time. So the group that's controlled it, the X-Protect group that's been a part of both the aerospace companies and the intelligence community, it operates in the corridor right between them. It's been able to keep it out of the public purview, and it's been able to keep it out of the government apparatus of research and all the rest of it. So whatever they've gained from it, whatever they've gleaned from it, they've maintained that wall of secrecy with it. It seems like the X-Share people, that group, the T.T. Brown type group, Kennedy wanting to share it with the Russians to get a better relationship going. Those factions exist, and they are strong factions, but they don't seem to have had the same impact and they have a much more difficult problem in a way. Keeping something a secret and then lording that secret and advantage is one type of activity, and that's what the intelligence agencies do quite well. How do you share the thing and get the support, and also educate the public on a kind of a crash program to get them up to snuff with it? So they want to get they want to share and move the culture forward. Those people tend to get ousted. And so we've seen them rise up at different times and get ousted. And Kennedy is probably the best example. But here's the other weirdness about the groups that are going on. When you watch the Congress and the congressmen and the senators and these people that we've pointed out, like Gallagher and Galejo, Gillibrand, there's a lot of G's in that, isn't there? And I've been doing these tweets kind of as a joke at them, like, tell us your UFO story. How'd you get involved with this? It's so strange that they are so gung-ho about this UFO issue that it tells you they've heard something in the back room, that something about this is going to come out. So either they're going to unveil the technology, they're going to unveil the threat, but these people know there's a boondoggle coming and they have to be a part of it, and they want to be the face of it. And that explains the presence of these many, many unusual congressmen and women being so gung-ho and talking. Gallagher was talking about how the aliens are time travelers, have come back here to save us. So what, the U.S. Congress has become like Art Bell from 1996? It's kind of strange, isn't it?
What specific save us from what?
Oh, save humanity. So I'm sure there's a variety of scenarios.
Are they supposed to be us in the future?
Yes.
Humans? Okay, did something go wrong then?
Well, there's a number of scenarios like that. Like I said, they're not making anything original. They're borrowing concepts that people have put out there. This is the era of co-opting things that we've been talking about, right? We in the public, we in the ideas room. And so they take these communities, they look through, 10, 20, 30 years of these people interacting. They notice that UFOs are the highest searched item, and they realize we need to do something with this. We need to spin it to our own benefit. So they take stories, and what does this guy sit down and do? One of the people starts talking about, it could be ancient gods or something like that. So, he's basically, that's the Zecharia Sitchin line. Okay. Gallagher talks about time travel. It's us from the future. It's Whitley Strieber. So they're all borrowing from things that are already out there, and they're just co-opting little ideas around this. I mean, suddenly, remember, one of the things that Elizondo did is said, well, I actually, I'm psychic. And he starts, one of these guys who wanted to join up with them and was doing UAPX, he got so freaked out because Lou came up to him and was like, oh, I can remote view your future and all this stuff. And, Elizondo, Elizondo to me is the ultimate in this. He just moves from position to position to do anything to be the face of that UFO piece. And I think that Nolan, it's the same thing. Now we're looking at these people saying on the CIA side, I'm a contactee. As I've pointed out, it's so beyond absurd that you would be the contactee and in the CIA and just happen to want to bring everyone to Jesus about the UFO threat. I mean, that's stretching the truth. So I think this is the era of the co-opt. The co-opt is on. Remember when Hillary Clinton was said in relation to Ron DeSantis sending those people who had come across the border, the migrants, over to Martha's Vineyard up here. And she said, that's human trafficking. And just think about all the things about Clinton and human trafficking that we've seen over the years. And, they will appropriate anything, just like any good psychopath would. When you call them out on something, they'll turn the argument around and use the exact same language on you. So we have to be really connected on this thing, and having a good, solid discussion around the UFO file and the manipulation of the Central Intelligence Agency on that file and how the media is blowing it up as a threat is exactly the antidote. It's this discussion that we're having right here is exactly what they do not want out there. They don't want this conversation happening. Let me tell you, everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist X State of the Union. watch out, going deep tonight. It's the UFO file key. We've gone through Stepford Biden talking about Armageddon. We've gone through Ukraine UFO situation, Avi Loeb pretending he's the big know-it-all on that, and President Kennedy and the different difficulties that he had, but bringing us through the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago, as we have these people kind of very clumsily leading us into World War III now. We'll take a couple more of your questions. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, and especially if you're new now, sign up for our free newsletter that keeps you in the loop with us. It lets you know about the important interviews that we have coming up, and the fascinating X-Series shows, some events, some documentaries. It's going to get crazy, let me tell you. And we're going to have some fantastic guests this month. And of course, I asked Dr. Farrell as soon as he can. He's going to come back as well. We're going to have a great interview with him. And this is going to be a great interview month. Just wait till you see what's coming up. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, channeling the heart, Barbara Joyce. Aren't we coming up on the arrival the Transcenders have been waiting for, X-111?
Interesting. Well, the Transcenders, let me tell you, I spent a good deal of time talking with them before Rick Thurston, who was the channeler for the Transcenders, passed away very young. I mean, he's 55 years old. It's quite a shock. But they had this fantastic prediction about the New York skyline, October 13th, that the UFOs would show up in 2010. This is all the way back. I was working for a magazine at the time, and I got a news fax about it, and I got an email about it. I actually had a PDF, and it was a prediction from this guy. And the guy was an ex-NORAD officer. And then afterwards, after it happened, I tried to get in touch with him, and I learned that he was doing some interviews, and then he died. And but I found out that his source was this channeler, Rick Thurston. It was very much like an Edgar Casey style source. And I ended up talking with him for maybe like 10 or 12 hours that I recorded all of it. And he was absolutely fascinating. But he was saying that there were going to be more of these unveilings. And he pinpointed that the next place that they would happen after the New York display would be Russia. But everyone expected it to happen immediately after. And when it didn't, or there were sightings there, but it wasn't quite the same dramatic thing that took place. Now, what's interesting is the October 13th, 2010 incident got, even good UFO researchers don't know what I'm talking about when this happens. There's some of the best footage of these things, because that morning, CBS TV were setting up to do an interview about something else. And there's tons of cell phone footage of this thing, but they had their camera trained on the sky during the whole thing. And so that somebody in that CBS chain put that footage out. And so there's really good daytime footage of these craft just sitting. And so there's something, the idea that there would be a follow-up from that was in the Transcenders playbook. And the whole idea there was they were going to become more obvious. But the Transcenders, there was a whole cosmology there about how the ETs were visiting to repair some of the things that were going on in relation to the environment, and that they were going to be, during that process, visible. So I think it's very fascinating, and I think that work is still very unexplored. But it made a big impact on me. Thurston was the real deal. Unbelievable. He was like Edgar Casey.
Did they give any timeline?
Well, they talked about a great deal. And, what's interesting is if you go to Stan Fulham's book, they discuss how they basically predict COVID. And so I found that interesting as well. They also talk about the whole land rising piece. And I did a quote from that in the Pole Shift episode. I read from the the Challenges of Change book. I have a series of recordings with them. I'm going to go back over some of that. Maybe I can put some of that out for an episode. It's probably a really good idea, but they were the real thing. And, so we're lucky when we encounter people like that. I've been lucky to encounter Gigi, and Gigi Young's work, because when you do this, when you're really doing this kind of dark journalism, you have to incorporate a psychic, mystical side of it, or you'll miss so much of it. And if I was just looking at it from a deep state level, if I was just looking, from a government corruption level, eventually it would leave you with a lot of questions, because there are other forces, there's other kind of a cosmology built into the whole thing. And so to have fantastic people like Gigi out there, we're lucky. But yeah, Thurston was quite remarkable. And I'll tell you this, whenever I spoke with Thurston, I felt, you felt it, your own energy body is responding to what was going on. So, and he told me a lot of very interesting things that have come to pass. Yes.
Sacred Forest. And when does the Antarctica aspect come into play?
See, this is fascinating. To me, that goes directly into the land rising piece. This has to do with the shift, and it's predicted inside the mystery schools. There was a thread that came up after the mystery schools were out there, so the Steiner work, the theosophical work, and the Casey work brought it all into our attention by the 1960s. And then afterwards, there were other groups, maybe like Elizabeth Clare Prophet and things of this nature, who try to follow up literally on some of this stuff. And one of the things that they did in the case of Elizabeth Clare Prophet is they bought a large swath of land in Livingston, Montana, farmland and everything else. And if you go back far enough, you can see in the Casey readings that he starts talking to this guy about how Livingston, Montana must someday feed the world, along with portions of South Africa, which was in the 2012 movie. So there's something very interesting about that and that follow-up, I think, where you see that there's an awareness that the mystery schools, like the Gurdjieff work, they knew there was going to be a shift, and that there should be groups that would be ready to switch to a more basic, a back to the land type movement. And so I find that interesting. It's throughout the mystery school literature. And if you go into biodynamic farming in the Steiner work, you're finding the same thing. It's the awareness of real kind of holism. It's a real holistic piece. In the 90s, you can go through and look at that 90s into the 2000s piece, and it is heavily marketed, kind of new age version of the same thing. But that thread is there about, a shift taking place. And there were a lot of people anticipating it. And what happened was you got the kind of Gaia TV types who imitated it and decided, I'm going to be outlandish, and you always had these remote viewers. Do you remember the remote viewer, Ed? What was his name?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, shoot. Someone out there knows it. But this guy was always coming out and he was saying, North Korea is going to dump a nuke. I saw it in my remote view. And he just come out.
Man, was he negative?
He did. And he made terrible predictions, right?
Mhm.
I mean, if you're a remote viewer, quit, because
Dames?
Ed Dames.
Mhm.
Yeah, he was the one. And, so, I mean, this is the interesting thing. Remember Gordon Michael Scallion?
Mhm.
Sounds like an omelet, Gordon Michael Scallion. But he, this guy used to come out and just imitate, like he would say, oh, I had this vision. And I knew the readings so well, because I've been reading the Edgar Casey readings since I was like 7 years old. And he would use the exact same phrase, like the greater mass of Japan must go into the sea, and he was using the quote. And I was like, you've just been reading the Casey books and regurgitating this stuff, So, we've had a lot of players on this. And so, thank God we've had enough of the real deal to balance the thing out. But I highly believe that there's a mystery school thread about Earth changes, and that Antarctica is involved. And that, it's funny because a lot of people have said, well, that must be because Antarctica is Atlantis. And, someone sent me a thing about, didn't you watch the thing about the Reichstag structure in Sahara? That's Atlantis. It's very interesting. Atlantis is called Atlantis because it's in the Atlantic Ocean. And Plato's version of it was it's the Gulf of Mexico on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. The mystery school piece has that. Now, whatever the landmass that is associated with the Pira-Reis map, it shows Antarctica with no ice on it. So it was a thriving continent. So this is a neighbor continent to Atlantis. There's no question that this is what was going on. By the way, that Sahara structure, if you go into the Casey readings, he talks about the Atlanteans migrating there and that the Sahara at the time had a totally different climate, just like they find rain damage on the Sphinx from 10,500 BC. The poles shifted, we know, in that 12,000 year period. And we're leading up to, I think this is what the mystery schools were getting at, we're leading up to a big revelation around this, that we're in that period. And I think what they're trying to do at the top, they're very aware of these prophecies as well. And I think that they're trying to control it for the most ideal circumstances for themselves, including the land rising part, which I did. I got a story on the land rising in the Pacific. Let's see if I have it here. I can show it. But these things are happening. And, this is what's going down. They don't talk about the land rising part because they don't want Uri to know anything about it, but land is rising. Make no mistake. Miss Olivia, 2 more questions and we're out.
Okay, I have a bunch that are all related. So Truth Gambit says, quote, something strange about elite world leaders that convinces me there is an inhuman element among us trying to destroy us. They are not Earthlings. Bobo the Clown says, I wonder if Fauci and other deep state operatives are experimenting to change the DNA of human beings. Could the medical and deep state scientific community be making alien hybrids? And Zara Drew says they can make soulless clones, and therefore they are at war with human women who deliver humans with souls.
Oh, that's really true. That war, we've seen all kinds of attempts on that. Well, look, sticking with the UFO file theme here, all of those contactee style people, the legitimate ones, they had experiences relating directly to the aliens testing them, observing, examining their sexual organs. In other cases, we have stories about people who thought that their eggs were taken and hybrids were made and that they actually got to see them. There's a lot of that material. And some of it isn't so sensationalist. By the time you go and look into the 90s and see the X-Files and things like that, and they use the theme over and over again, and it gets hyped up and other shows imitate it and stuff. But in fact, there are very convincing cases from America to Australia to Europe relating to this. So it was already, the cloning thing was in the air. Aldous Huxley gave us the cloning piece in Brave New World in 1930. Aldous Huxley was also a student of P.D. Ouspensky and neighbors and friends with Krishnamurti. So you've got 2 mystery schools informing his, what seems like a grand vision in 1930. And it also seems that in Huxley's case, where he was connected with this incredibly elite family, he was turning against that. And he was trying to get this information out and talking about how they're going to turn everyone into epsilons and make test tube babies and give us soma and all the rest of it. So absolutely 100%. In terms of the human part of this, I think that there's a level at which you stop functioning as a human when your conscience is so shut down. And I think that there are groups in the leadership that operate exactly like that. And it's a frightening thing to see. But when you consider the whole Ahrimanic piece in the Steiner literature and what he talked about coming through there seems to be this idea that some people are just black holes and that they will serve as kind of a conduit for this Ahrimanic force, astral force. And that what's happening, I think, with the technology and the rapid adaptation to the technology, we've seen this with certain people where they start to become a dead zone. They start to become, their identity is wiped out and something else seems to take its place. Now, before we had the technology on overdrive, they used to call that a walk-in, right? And it is interesting. To me, I think it's absolutely viable to consider that this has happened on a grand scale with the leadership. And if you look into anthroposophy in particular, you find references to this, and that the kind of inhabiting spirit of the thing around Ahriman. So therefore, this is what we're looking at. That the showdown is between being human and between being this kind of automated thing. And we all know what Casey said about the Atlanteans and the things, and we don't want to be things. We want to have a full human experience with our spiritual nature intact. And this is, I think, anathema. But I do feel one thing that you're saying there is, on the leadership end, it seems like the aspect that is anti-human or inhuman, it feels much more comfortable coming out and showing itself that way. Don't you feel that? It certainly does. Absolutely. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist State of the Union, State of the Union. We've gone deep on the UFO file tonight, and great questions from all of you in the ideas room. This is absolutely fascinating. Olivia, the last question.
I'm going to take this in a different direction. Miguel Oniga says emasculation and man deriding are a big part of it. I've been watching a lot of Jordan Peterson this last week and really enjoying it.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to me that he's the right man with the right message at the right time, because it's a very human message. It's about integrity and character and meaning. I know he doesn't frame it as an anti-transhumanist message, but it really is. It's getting back to basics, what's true and what's good about our humanity.
Yeah. I think some of Peterson's stuff is good as well. I feel like fundamentally there's an awareness spreading, even from people who used to be more plugged into the establishment, in my opinion. And it's sort of like, you guys can go over the cliffs and go over the falls, and run off a cliff if you want to, but I'm stopping. And there's a reconsideration. There's kind of a no man's land for some of these people, because if on one hand they're not going with the establishment, but on the other hand they've been a part of it, and now they have to rejoin human society. It's an interesting kind of place that they occupy there. There's a kind of a purgatory action to it of neither being in one place or the other. But I think we're seeing more of that. And it seems to me that raising our voices about these things is the crucial element. And it's why I think that the deep state and the controllers so much want to shut down the conversation, as we've seen through censorship, as we've seen on a variety of sites. And I'm not talking about people using irresponsible rhetoric. I think it's reasonable to suggest that people use responsible rhetoric. But, you mention a particular type of therapy, or you mention a particular type of pharmaceutical company, you get banned, or political personality. That's ridiculous. That is, Nazi style fascist technique. So we've seen it, but America's all about free speech, and America's all about freedom and independence and all the rest of it. It is innate to Americans and to people around the world. So I think they run into tremendous trouble when they try to rewire Americans. What they have to do is radicalize the people against, the regular people who are working from a kind of a constitutional, fundamental basis of human respect and soul spiritual connection. And it seems to me that this thing, that sort of the enemy of this thing, it has identified as people who still have their spirituality and humanity intact. And there's always been a movement to degrade people. I remember these fascinating comments from the director, Frank Capra, who had this kind of, wonderful vision of humanity and did all these movies that were classics in their day. And he was sitting with a friend who was showing him in the 80s these television commercials. And he said, "Isn't it horrible that they're making us hate humanity?" And like, little did he know what was coming, because if you look at 80s commercials, it's very soft entrainment then. Now is the real full-on kind of sick thing. But I think it is important to always maintain your humanity through any situation. And this is the thing that I believe is where the real struggle is going on. And in terms of our knowledge base, which is why I bring the UFO file into this, because that piece politically, I don't think we can understand the world that we're living in if we don't have that piece in hand, if we don't have it as part of our reasoning process. Then I think, we can understand it from a few levels, not just, oh, there are aliens there and my whole life is about thinking about aliens. Not at all, but more, there's been a large scale knowledge differential between the leadership and the public on the ground. And there's been an incredible wall of secrecy in relation to that. And so many of the things that don't make sense to us that we see around the world are related directly to the UFO file and what it represents politically, technologically, and scientifically. And that's why I think we're seeing so much of this manipulation. So between that and the kind of mystery school knowledge about this wave of Ahrimanic invasion, we're in a very pivotal place, I think. So we need the best minds with us, and we'll try to get more of them here and the ideas from the Dark Journalist show for you. Everyone, thank you very much. And Miss Olivia, you're up.
I'm going to throw this. I know you're not going to be able to answer this question,
Okay.
but this is worth its own
Oh,
show.
that's
Caritas Tarot. How does Scientology and its space opera focus factor into the CIA op?
I'm going to save Scientology because I have a show on Scientology coming up, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's called Hubbard in the Hot Zone. And it's coming soon. So I'll save all my Scientology for that. I did show this on screen earlier. It's a new island has arisen in the Pacific following underwater eruption. A submerged volcano on the seamount known as Home Reef in the central Tonga Islands has awoken after 16 years of deep sleep. Lava and rock fragments began to ooze into the ocean while plumes of steam and ash burst through the surface. Land rising is reality. The mystery schools put it on the map for a reason. That's something we need to pay a lot of attention to. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, I've got a bunch of people to thank. Bobo the Clown, Sarah, Gillenjoy R, Occult Fan, Ivan Langley, Jim Sarge 3ID, John Lavalette, Global Atlantis, Wilbur Wobbler, Wait a Minute 72, Daryl Dothrow, Jimmy Kennemer, Duder 76, Jordan Banner, Nightline Legal, Jay Vanderbest, Bo Krills, GDNPB, Karen Carpenter, Robert Mearns, Robert Scott, Bob Bindert, Bari, Animal Black, Wayne Peak, Planet Gone Nuts, and Jennifer Walters. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, incredible. Your support has really helped us develop these shows, and it means a great deal to us, our subscribers as well. Thank you for getting behind the program and allowing us to do these reports for you. And we have many fascinating things coming up for you. We'll be back with you next Friday. And it's been a great couple of days. First with Millie, and tonight it's the State of the Union with Olivia. Olivia did great job. Fantastic.
I was a little off tonight.
The
Sorry.
picture that I showed is a picture of the end of Sherlock Holmes fighting against the evil deep state Professor Moriarty, and the ultimate battle takes place when they both fight and struggle against each other and go over those waterfalls into the depths of that battle. And that's really the battle that we're all taking on right now. So we're going to need all hands on deck for the Holmes Professor Moriarty battle is on. Everyone, we will see you all next Friday. And let me do a couple of shout outs, actually. Into the waterfall, Bo Krill says. Exactly. That's the way I'm looking at it. Fantastic. Karen Carpenter, it's great to see you. Katie Cat. Jeremy Brett did a great job as Sherlock Holmes, of course. Fantastic. My favorite Holmes. Exactly. Najat, it's great to see you out there. Miguel, thank you, sir. Much obliged. Is Wings Detroit hockey or chicken? That's a good one. Shamanist Anam Kara, fantastic show, DJ. Thank you. Really good to have you out there.
Now
Fantastic.
I'm getting hungry.
That'd do it. Woo. Johan Wolf, great to see you. Thank you. He says, Olivia, thank you, voice. Exactly. Nicely done. Najat, great to see you. Fantastic. Jason May, excellent. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Chris Bradley's got the word of the day. That's the word. Can we send all these elites to Mars? I couldn't agree with you more. Get your ass to Mars. Please do a line of t-shirts. Remarkable. Caritas Tarot, just for you. I definitely will. I can swim. The Black Zionist. I like it. Wow, I'm down for swimming. People have got it. They figured out that swim piece immediately. Mark Lane, thank you very much, sir. Much obliged. I want the DJ pins, says Bo Krills. Indeed. Short Order Cook, great questions early on. Thank you. He was in the pre-chat too, I believe. And fantastic questions. Everybody did a great job out there tonight. And of course, Dr. Farrell. It's great to see Joseph out there. And I know Walter was out there. Great to see you, sir. Kane Samuel, thank you. Hey, look at this. Thomas Tyson. I like Olivia. I like Olivia. I like Olivia. Nicely done. Yeah, Scott, New York City, Mouse Edit. Just a little bit of everybody tonight. A lot of familiar
Is it Mouse
faces.
Edit or is it Moused It?
Moused it. Oh, good point. I think you've just opened up the steganography on that one. DJ Gone Wild. That's the next episode. In Vladati. Mikkel Groom. Wow. Tyler James. Jimmy Kimmener. Fantastic group out there
Can I
tonight.
throw you a question?
Sure.
Okay. Jay Mallet was asking, I love this question. The question is, why are we in a world that will not allow good ideas?
Oh, I'm certain that good ideas can penetrate through. Don't ever get disgusted on that level, and they will find their outlet. I mean, look at the incredible people and the ideas room as an example. It'll find you. It'll definitely find
Although
you.
there is an effort to suppress good ideas, innovation, right? We
absolutely.
have cultural stagnation.
Alex Kuhn said, how come you didn't enter politics? I think really it's
You
after
slipped through the cracks.
After the Earth Changes shift, I'll be in the new Earth Changes thing. I'll participate in that political process. Mr. Wonderful. Hey, that's my name. What's going on here? Good ideas are generous. No, it's your name. Brian Storm. Wow, fantastic. Whew. They are hijacked. Get Senator Gillibrand on. You know it. You know that's a great idea. But she'll have to answer all those sketchy questions about the NXIVM cult. Oh, that could get a little uncomfortable, let's face it. Oh, well said, DJ. Thank you. Planet Gone Nuts. Great name. DJ is too smart to be a politician. Everyone's doing the great lines tonight. Able-bodied. Only if good ideas make money, then you have to beat UK to the patent office. Everybody's really like on their game here, and it's this late. Unbelievable. Good ideas are dangerous. Taz Jacobs, Mikhail Grun. Wow, fantastic. I know we had Gigi out there earlier. She's doing great stuff now. We will see you all next week, everyone. And thanks, DJ and OJ. Nicely done. Thank you. Someone's getting a cannoli out there.
Oh, don't say
Wow.
cannoli.
Simulation
I'm
theory.
starving.
Fantastic. DJ for Atlantis, New Atlantis present. There we go. I'm showing up for New Atlantis. I'm there. Dark Truth. Thank you very much. There's a lot of presidential talk tonight. I'm going to reconsider everything. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us. And bye-bye. We love you. And remember, it says end broadcast, but after all, Miss Olivia,
Never really ends.
it never really ends. Have a great night, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your weekend. It's been great spending time with you. We'll talk soon.